Have you ever stood at the edge of moving water and felt, for just a moment, that the water was not moving away from you but toward you? Not downstream. Toward you, as if the creek itself had noticed you standing there and had turned and was reading you the way water reads a stone, slowly, patiently, learning every crack. Have you ever knelt at a creek bank and looked at your own reflection and understood, in some place below thought, that the face looking back up at you was not quite keeping up, that when you tilted your head, the reflection tilted a half-second late, as if it had to think about it first, as if it was deciding whether to follow? There is a creek in the hill country of eastern Tennessee called Black Branch. It is a real place. It runs for 11 miles out of a limestone ridge called Harrow Hill and comes down through a narrow valley they used to call the Briar Pocket before the county maps renamed it in 1931. The water in it is cold year-round, colder than the air in August, colder than it has any right to be given where it comes from, and it runs dark, not from mud, but from the tannins of the hemlocks that line both banks, so that the surface of it looks, on a still day, like weak tea held up to the light. The kind of water that shows you your face and makes you wish it had not. On the 14th of May, 1876, 4 children were brought to the deep pool at the bend of Black Branch, called the Deacon's Reach, to be baptized. Their names were Cora Vestal, 9 years old, Edmund Vestal, 7, Nettie Pruitt, 11, and a boy who is listed in the church record only as Harlan, no surname, age given as 8, described in the margin as a ward of the congregation. The ceremony was performed by a preacher named Absalom Gentry. It was a Sunday in May, which is the right season for it, and the creek was running clear and cold and about 18 inches deep at the Deacon's Reach, which is the right depth for a full immersion baptism of a child. There were 14 witnesses standing on the bank. The light was good, the morning was warm, and the water was changed 5 times. Not the creek. The creek went on running the way it always ran. What was changed was the water in the Deacon's Reach, the pool itself, the still deep place where the children went under 5 times between the first immersion and the last, in ways that 14 people witnessed and could not agree on, and spent the rest of their lives not quite managing to describe. I am going to tell you what happened, all of it, slowly, the way it deserves to be told. Before I go any further, if this is the kind of case you would want a whole dark season of, not just one night, there is a collection. It is called What the Water Keeps. 9 cases, 9 bodies of water, 4 states, 1851 to 1964. Every one of them a place where something went into the water, and what came out was not the same thing that went in. About 8 hours of it, meant to be listened to low, with the windows dark and the doors barred. The link is in the description below and pinned at the top of the comments. And before I go on, tell me where you are listening from tonight. Put it in the comments. The town, the county, the country. I want to see how far a story like this one reaches into the dark, and if you have not already, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means the next one of these finds you on the next night you cannot sleep. Now then, let me take you back to 1876, and to that creek, and to 4 children standing at the edge of dark water on a warm May morning, not yet knowing what was about to ask something of them. The valley they called the Briar Pocket sits in a fold of hill country that the railroad did not reach until 1908, and even then only barely, with a spur line that served a sawmill at the north end and did not pretend to serve anything else. Before the railroad, before 1908, you got to the Briar Pocket the way you got anywhere in that kind of country, which is to say you walked, or you followed a creek bed on a mule, or you did not go at all. Most people chose the third option. The valley had about 230 residents in the census of 1870, and it had about 240 in the census of 1880, and the difference of 10 people over 10 years is the kind of population growth that happens when a place is not quite dying and not quite living, just persisting, the way a fire persists when you are not sure whether to feed it or let it go out. The community had a name that predated the Briar Pocket name by a good 30 years. They called it Reach. One word. Not Reach Hollow or Reach Creek or Reach Crossing, just Reach. The way you might name a place for what it does to the people who live there. There was one church. It was called the Church of the Briar Pocket Redeemer, which is not a denomination you will find in any registry, because it was not a denomination, it was a congregation, one of those loose, particular, self-governing assemblies of mountain people who had put up a building and agreed on a preacher and did not feel the need to ask anybody's permission about what they believed. They used the King James Bible. They baptized by full immersion in the creek. They did not take collections on Sundays, but they passed a hat at funerals, and the hat always came back full because in a community of 240 people, the funerals were everybody's business. The preacher, in 1876, was Absalom Gentry. He had been the preacher since 1861, when the previous preacher, a man named Tull Hobbs, had walked out of a Wednesday evening service in October of that year, mid-sentence, mid-sermon, and gone home, and nailed his door shut, and not come out for 11 days. And when he finally came out, he got in a wagon and drove north, and nobody in the Briar Pocket ever saw him again. I am going to tell you what Tull Hobbs was saying when he stopped. And I am going to tell you why he stopped, but I need to give you Absalom Gentry first, and I need to give you the children, and I need to give you the creek. Because this case, like all the cases that matter, is built from the bottom up, and the bottom of it is the water. Absalom Gentry was 44 years old in the spring of 1876. He was a tall man, thin in the way of men who are always in motion and never quite eat enough, with a dark beard going gray and hands that were too big for his body, the kind of hands a man gets from years of outdoor work, which is the kind of work that being a preacher in that valley required, because a congregation of 230 mountain people needed a preacher who could also fix a roof and split rails and sit up through a night with a dying man and do the kind of quiet, useful things that make people trust a person with their Sundays. He had come to the Briar Pocket from Hancock County in the spring of 1861, 30 years old, carrying a Bible and a carpet bag and a letter of introduction from a primitive Baptist elder who described him as sound in his doctrine and steady in his person, and the congregation had tried him out for a month and then kept him. He had been sound and steady for 15 years. He was not a shouter. He was not a weeper. He was the kind of preacher who stood very still and spoke at a level just loud enough that you had to be paying attention to hear him, which is a more effective kind of preaching than most people give credit for. He had a wife named Patience who had died of fever in 1869, and he had not remarried. He had no children of his own. He lived in the 2-room parsonage attached to the church, and he kept a garden, and he visited the sick, and on Sunday mornings he stood up and said what he believed in a quiet voice, and for 15 years this had been enough. What I want to tell you before we get to the baptism is something about Absalom Gentry's relationship with Black Branch Creek, because it is not a simple relationship, and it did not begin in 1876, and the shape of it goes back further than the man himself. The Deacon's Reach, the deep pool at the bend where the baptisms were performed, was not called the Deacon's Reach in Absalom Gentry's time. That name came later, and I will tell you who gave it and why, but in 1876 the pool was called something else. The people of the Briar Pocket called it the Still Place, which is a name that tells you more about it in 2 words than a paragraph would. It was a pool about 30 feet across and maybe 8 feet deep at the center, formed where the creek bent hard to the left around a shelf of limestone, and the current slowed, and the water backed up on itself and went quiet. On the upstream side of the bend there was a shelf of flat rock, natural, almost level, that people had been using as a stepping-off place for baptisms since before anybody in the valley could remember. The congregation had not chosen it for the baptisms. It had been used for baptisms when they arrived, by whatever congregation had been there before them, and by whoever had been there before that. There is a carving on the limestone shelf, a set of marks that nobody in the valley ever explained to any outsider's satisfaction that a man from the State University looked at in 1952 and said was consistent with markings associated with, he admitted, be the work of someone's grandfather with a chipping stone and an afternoon to waste. I will tell you what the marks are later. They are going to matter more than you might expect. The water in the still place was different from the water in the rest of Black Branch, and this is not my interpretation and it is not folklore. It is the observation of every person who ever put their hand in it. The creek above the bend ran cold, as I said, cold enough in August to hurt your wrist. The still water in the pool ran colder, not by a little. People described it as the kind of cold that comes up from below, not the kind that comes down from the mountains. The kind of cold that lives in the dark of the earth, in the underground water that has not seen the sun in 1,000 years. In 1874, 2 years before the baptism, a boy named Creed Alcorn waded into the still place on a hot July afternoon to cool off and came back out faster than he had gone in and would not say, for 3 days. Why? When he finally said why, his mother wrote it in a letter to her sister in Virginia, and that letter was found in a trunk in 1987, and the letter is one of the 4 documents at the center of this case, and I have a photocopy of it on my desk as I record this. The boy said he felt something pass between his legs. Not a fish, not a turtle. He had fished that creek his whole life, and he knew what a fish felt like. He said it was the water itself that moved purposefully, like something that had decided to go past him, something too large to see and too cold to be alive. He said it moved past him, going upstream, against the current. He never went in the still place again, and neither, after he told that story at a Sunday dinner, did most of the children in the valley. And the congregation baptized in it anyway, every spring and early fall for 14 years, because the deacon's reach, the still place, was where baptisms were done, and where they had always been done, and a story about a boy feeling something move in the water was not, by itself, a reason to change a practice that went back further than living memory. That is the water. Now let me give you the children. Cora Vestal was 9 years old in the spring of 1876. She was the eldest of 6 children of a man named Darwin Vestal and his wife Hazel, who farmed 40 acres of creek-bottom ground a mile and a half above the still place. She was, by every account, a serious child. Quiet, observant, the kind of 9-year-old who listens to adult conversations from another room and files them away. She had a particular habit that her mother mentioned in 2 separate letters. She did not like mirrors. Not a phobia exactly, she did not avoid them with any drama. She simply preferred not to look at them. And when a looking-glass was in the room, she arranged herself so that she was not facing it. When her mother asked her about it once, she said she did not see the point of looking at a face you were already wearing. Her brother Edmund Vestal was 7. Where his sister was serious, he was restless, a boy who could not sit still in a church pew for 20 minutes, who had already broken 2 windows and 3 fence rails and one of his own fingers in the ordinary course of being himself. He was small for 7, with his mother's dark coloring and a gap between his front teeth that he could whistle through, which he did, constantly, to the distraction of everyone around him. His one reliable stillness was water. Put Edmund Vestal on the bank of a creek and he went as quiet as an old man could sit there for hours, watching the current, perfectly content. His mother said, in a letter written some years after the baptism, that even as a small boy, Edmund had a way of looking at the water that was different from the way other children looked at it. She wrote, "And I am going to read this exactly. He looked at it the way you look at a person you are listening to, as if it was talking and he was trying to follow. I thought it was sweetness. I think now it was something else, and I think Black Branch knew it before I did." Nettie Pruitt was 11, the oldest of the 4. She was a Pruitt by her mother, who had come to the valley from over the ridge in 1868 after her husband was lost in an accident at a timbering camp whose name nobody in the family remembered or wanted to. The mother, a woman named Viola Pruitt, had arrived in the Briar Pocket with Nettie, then 3, and a horse, and not much else, and had survived the way women survived in that kind of country, which is through labor and proximity to people who could not afford to let a neighbor fail. Viola was a midwife's assistant by 1870, and a midwife in her own right by 1873, and the valley relied on her the way it relied on the creek itself, constantly and without acknowledgement, and only consciously when things went wrong. Nettie had grown up watching her mother put her hands in the hardest places that existed and keep them steady. She was a tall, angular girl, and serious in a different way from Cora Vestal, where Cora's seriousness was internal, a quality of attention. Nettie's seriousness was outward, a quality of decision. She was the kind of 11-year-old who already understood that some problems did not wait for adults. I want to tell you one thing about Nettie Pruitt before we go any further, because it is the detail that haunted me the longest after I finished my time with this case. She was, in the spring of 1876, 11 years old, and had never been baptized because her mother had delayed it. Viola Pruitt, the midwife, the practical woman, the woman who had survived by not romanticizing anything, Viola Pruitt had put off her daughter's baptism 3 times in 4 years. She told the preacher each time that Nettie was not ready. And each time Absalom Gentry asked in what way she was not ready, Viola Pruitt said only, "She is not ready for that water." And she said it in a tone of voice that did not invite the follow-up question. She relented in the spring of 1876. I have not been able to determine why she relented, and I have looked. The record does not say. What the record says, in a note in Absalom Gentry's own hand in the church book, is Nettie Ann Pruitt, age 11, presented for baptism at her mother's request after some delay. Mother present. After some delay. 3 years of delay, and the church record calls it some, and the mother present is in there too, noted, as if it was notable that a mother attended her child's baptism, which it is notable because it is specified, which means it was not always the case, which means Viola Pruitt insisted on being there, and Absalom Gentry thought it was worth writing down that she was. And then there is Harlan. No surname. 8 years old, listed in the margin of the church book as a ward of the congregation, which in a small independent mountain congregation in 1876 meant something specific, a child without parents, or without parents willing to claim him, taken in by the community collectively, and housed with whoever had room that season. I have spent more time on Harlan than on any other person in this case, and I am going to tell you right now what I found and what I did not find, and let you sit with both. What I found: a boy, approximately 8 years old, who arrived in the Briar Pocket Valley sometime in the winter of 1875, apparently alone, apparently on foot, in weather cold enough to have killed him, and did not. He was found on the road above the still place by a man named Owen Cutts, brought to the church, fed, warmed, and asked his name and origin, and neither answered directly. He gave his first name as Harlan. He could not or would not give a family name. He could not or would not say where he had come from. He was not identified by any subsequent inquiry. No poster matched his description. No family appeared to claim him. What I did not find, any record of this child prior to the winter of 1875. No birth record, no school record, no prior community in any direction that acknowledged him. He arrived in that valley the way something arrives in a dream, fully formed, from nowhere, without prior context, without explanation. He was a quiet boy. The record from the families who housed him that winter describe him consistently: quiet, helpful, willing to work, ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint. He had very light eyes, described variously as pale gray, near colorless, almost silver, and a habit that multiple people noted independently: he would not sit with his back to the creek. Wherever he was in a room, whatever position he took, he arranged himself so that he could see the direction of Black Branch, not the creek itself. Necessarily, in most of the houses where he stayed, The creek was not visible from inside, but the direction of it. He oriented himself toward it, the way a compass needle orients itself, without apparent effort, as a matter of simple necessity. One of the families he stayed with, a family named Beckett, had a daughter 2 years older than Harlan, named June Beckett, and June Beckett told the story of that winter to her own granddaughter in 1941, and the granddaughter wrote it down, and the written version came to me through a chain of County Historical Society holdings that took me 18 months to trace. June Beckett said this about Harlan, and I am going to read it as her granddaughter wrote it. He was the stillest child I ever saw in my life. Not sad still, not frightened still, the way water is still when it is very deep. Grandmother said she used to watch him and wonder what was happening down inside him that she could not see. She said the day before they took him to the creek for the baptism, she found him standing in the yard, facing the direction of the water, and she asked him what he was listening for, and he said, "Nothing. I am waiting." And she asked what he was waiting for, and he said he did not know yet, but that when it happened, he would know it, and she did not know what he meant, but she said years later she thought she did. Those are the 4 children. Let me tell you about the morning. The 14th of May, 1876 was a Sunday. The church record gives the weather as fine, which is a word that appears in the church records of that era to mean clear and warm. Not overcast, not raining, not any of the things that make a spring baptism in a cold creek more difficult than it already is. It was fine. The kind of May morning in the Tennessee hill country that makes you understand why people kept coming back to that kind of country even when it was hard, because in the right light, in the right season, there is nowhere on earth more beautiful, and the people who lived there knew it the way you know the smell of your own house. The congregation gathered at the church at 8 in the morning for the first service. There were 31 people present, according to Absalom Gentry's count, which he recorded in his usual careful way. After the first service, which ran about an hour, the congregation walked to the still place as a body, which took about 20 minutes on the creekside path, and they stood on the bank, and the 4 children were brought forward. 14 of those 31 people were positioned where they could see the water clearly. The other 17 were on the bank or on the path or behind people taller than them. These distinctions matter, because what happened at the still place was not seen uniformly, and the testimony we have, and there is more testimony on this event than on any other event in the history of the Briar Pocket Valley, breaks along lines that have everything to do with where people were standing and what angle they had on the water. I want to give you the testimony carefully, because it is what we have, and because I have no interest in improving it. What happened at Black Branch on the 14th of May, 1876 is strange enough on its own terms without my touching it. The first baptism was Cora Vestal. She was the oldest of the Vestal children, and she went first because that is how it was done in that congregation, oldest first, as a matter of setting an example. She walked into the water at the stepping-off rock, which came up to about her waist, and Absalom Gentry took her hands and said the words and put her under. 4 people described the moment of immersion. 3 of them described the same thing. 1 described something different, and the one who described something different is the one I want you to keep in mind. The 3 who described the same thing said the water went dark when she went under. Not the splash, not the disturbance of the surface, the pool. The whole pool went dark for the 2 or 3 seconds she was under, the way a glass of water goes dark when you pour ink into it, not from any one point but all at once. And then she came up, and the water was the way it had been before, pale and clear and tea-colored. The 4th witness, a woman named Ibby Turnbow, who was standing at the downstream end of the bank and had therefore a different angle on the pool than the others, said that the water did not go dark. She said the water went still. She said the ripples from Cora going in spread out from the child and reached the edges of the pool and did not come back, and that the surface of the pool was perfectly flat and glassy while Cora was under it, and that she saw, in that flat surface, a reflection of the sky, but the sky reflected was not the sky above them. She said the reflected sky was the sky of a different time of day. She said it was darker in the reflection. She said she could see stars in it. She said this to her husband that evening, and to 2 neighbors in the following week, and to a circuit preacher who came through the valley in June of 1876, and wrote it in his journal, and the circuit preacher's journal is one of the 4 documents at the center of this case. She said it quietly and without drama, and she never changed it. And she is the only one of the 14 witnesses who said it, and she is the only one of the 14 witnesses who had a clean angle on the surface of the pool at the moment of the first immersion. Cora Vestal came up out of the water. And here is the first thing that made 14 people go quiet and look at each other and then look away. She came up slowly. Not the way a child comes up out of cold water, gasping, blinking, shaking her head. She came up the way something surfaces that is not in a hurry. Her eyes were open. She was not coughing or spluttering. She stood in the water up to her waist with her eyes open and her hands at her sides, and she said, in a voice that the witnesses described as too level, too even, too much like the voice of a grown woman in a child's mouth, she said one word. She said, "Again." And then she blinked and coughed and looked like a 9-year-old child who has just had her head held under cold water, and she waded back to the bank, and her mother wrapped a quilt around her, and that was all. But the word hung there. Again. And Absalom Gentry, in his account of that morning, and he wrote an account, not in the church book, but in a private letter, and it is the 3rd of the 4 documents, and we will come to it at length. Absalom Gentry said that when Cora came up and said that word, he felt the hair on his forearms rise, and he looked down at the water, and the water of the still place had changed. He did not have the language for what he saw, and he said so. He said the water looked the same in every visible respect. Same temperature, same color, same depth, same slow current at the edges where the pool fed back into the main channel. But something about the quality of it was different. He wrote, it was as if the water had been paying no attention and was now paying close attention, the way a man in a crowd turns when he hears a sound he recognizes. I cannot say what changed. I can say that the pool was not the same pool it had been 20 seconds before. That is the first change. Edmund Vestal went next. He walked in off the stepping-off rock without hesitation, which was like him. Edmund was never afraid of water. And he went under, and the pool went dark again. All 3 witnesses who had seen it go dark before saw it go dark again. And then Edmund came up. He did not say, again. He came up the way a 7-year-old boy comes up out of Cold Creek water on a warm May morning, which is to say fast and gasping and shaking his head like a wet dog, and the congregation laughed, which is the kind of laugh that is also a release, and Edmund's mother reached for him, and he waded in toward the bank, and stopped. About 3 feet from the bank, in water up to his thighs, he stopped, and he turned around, not back toward the preacher, back toward the middle of the pool. He turned around, and he looked at the still place, at the deep center of it, and he was very quiet. And Absalom Gentry said he watched that 7-year-old boy look at the water the way you watch a person who has just heard their name called from a long way away and is trying to decide if they really heard it. He stood there for about 30 seconds. Then his mother called his name, sharply, and he turned back and waded in, and she pulled him out, and the quilt went around him, and the congregation settled again. Absalom Gentry looked at the water. The second change. He does not describe it in the letter as a visual change. He describes it as a change in the weight of the air above the pool. He says, the air above the water felt heavier. Not cold, not warm, heavier, the way air feels in the seconds before a storm begins, that compression, that sense that the sky is making a decision. He looked up. The sky above the still place was clear and fine and May warm, and there was no storm. The air above the water was heavy. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I want you to notice what is happening across these 2 baptisms. 2 children have gone into the water and come out changed, in small ways, in ways that are easy to explain away. A child saying a strange word, a child pausing at the bank. These are things you could look at and find ordinary reasons for. The cold of the water, the solemnity of the moment, children being strange, which is something children are. But Absalom Gentry was not a man given to strangeness, and he was looking at that pool after the second child came out, and he was aware that the pool had changed twice now, and he was the one who had to put 2 more children into it. He put Nettie Pruitt in next. And this is where the testimony diverges most sharply, and where I have spent the most time, and where I am going to have to ask you to hold 2 things at once for a while, because the witnesses do not agree, and I am not going to choose between them. Nettie Pruitt walked into the water. She walked slowly, which was noted because she was 11 years old, and the water was cold, and an 11-year-old girl should have flinched at least. She did not flinch. She walked in up to her waist, and Absalom Gentry took her hands, and she looked up at him, and he said later, in the private letter, that her eyes were wrong. Not wrong in any describable way, wrong the way a room is wrong when something in it has been moved and you cannot identify what. He said her eyes were her eyes and something about them was not. He put her under. What happened next is where the 14 witnesses become, effectively, 3 different groups of people who saw 3 different things. The first group, 5 people, on the upstream bank, looking down into the pool, said the water went white. Not dark, white, as if lit from underneath. They said the pool lit up from the bottom the way a lantern lights up from inside a paper shade, a diffuse white glow, and it lasted the length of time that Nettie was under, about 4 seconds, and then went out when she surfaced. The second group, 4 people, on the downstream bank, Ibby Turnbow among them, said the water went still again, the way it had gone still with Cora Vestal, completely flat, glassy. And Ibby Turnbow said the reflection was there again, the reflection of a different sky, a darker sky, and this time she saw something in the reflection she had not seen before. She said she saw a shape in the reflected sky. She described it later as a shape like a tree seen from below, branches spreading down from the reflected surface into the reflected sky below it. She said it was too big to be a tree. She said it was about the size of the ridge. The third group, the remaining 5 people, including Viola Pruitt, Nettie's mother, who was standing on the stepping-off rock, said nothing changed. They said the water was the water, and the child went in, and the child came out, and that was all they saw. What did Viola Pruitt see from the stepping-off rock? The woman who had delayed this baptism 3 times. The woman who had insisted on being there. She was standing closer to the water than anyone else on the bank, on the flat rock shelf, 8 feet from her daughter's immersion. She saw nothing. She said so. She stood there, and she saw water, and a child going under, and a child coming up, and nothing changed, and nothing happened, and it was fine and ordinary. I have thought about that more than I want to say. There is a thing about the still place that I am going to come back to, a thing that Absalom Gentry wrote down in his letter, and that a woman who had lived in the valley 50 years told him, and that will change how you hear what I just said. But I am not ready to give it to you yet. It will mean more when you know what came before it. Nettie Pruitt came up. She did not say anything. She did not pause. She came up the way Cora Vestal had come up, slowly, eyes open, standing in the water without coughing. But she did not say again. She turned her head and looked at the bank, and she found her mother's face in the crowd, and she looked at her mother for a long moment, and then she waded in. Viola Pruitt caught her daughter's hands as she came up the bank. She pulled her in close and wrapped the quilt and looked at her daughter's face with a professional kind of attention, the midwife's attention, the attention of a woman who has seen a great many faces in difficult moments and knows what she is looking for. Whatever she was looking for, she did not find it. Or she found what she had hoped she would find, or she found something else and did not say. Viola Pruitt did not speak of the baptism afterward, not to any of the witnesses, not to anyone she trusted, and there is only one account of her that touches on it at all, and that account is a second-hand report of something she said in the last year of her life, and it is 6 words long, and I will give them to you in the right place. 3 children down, the third change in the water, and then there was Harlan. This is the part that I want you to understand. I have handled with a great deal of care, because what the witnesses say about Harlan's baptism is more extreme than anything they say about the others, and I am aware of how that sounds. And I want to give you the testimony exactly as it exists, without my voice on top of it. Harlan came to the edge of the water. He did not need to be guided. He did not need a hand. He walked to the edge of the stepping-off rock on his own in his own time, and he stood there and looked at the water for a moment, for what the witnesses described as an unusual amount of time, longer than any of the other children, long enough that Absalom Gentry said his name once, quietly, to prompt him. And Harlan turned and looked at the preacher with those near colorless eyes and said, "I know." He said it the way you say it when someone tells you a thing you already know. Not rudely, just plainly, the way you acknowledge information. "I know." And then he walked into the water. He walked in up to his chest, before Absalom Gentry caught his hands to stop him. The water came up to Harlan's chest, which meant it came up to Absalom Gentry's waist, which was further into the pool than either of them should have been. The bottom of the still place slopes sharply at the center, and a man, knee-deep at the edge, can be waist-deep in 3 steps, and Harlan had taken 4. Gentry stopped him, pulled him back to the shallower place, where the water was at the child's waist, the right depth, and he took Harlan's hands, and he looked down at the boy. And here is what he wrote in the private letter, in the language of a man who has been preaching for 15 years and has never once, in all those years, written a sentence like this one. He wrote, "I looked into the face of that child, and I felt that I had been looked into first, and that whatever looked into me was not the boy." He put Harlan under. Every witness, all 14, the upstream group and the downstream group and Viola Pruitt on the stepping-off rock, every single one of them described the same thing. For the first time that morning, all 14 people saw the same thing. The water left, not the creek. The main channel kept running, but the still place, the pool, the deep, quiet bend where the 4 children had been baptized, the water in it went down, not out, down, as if something below had opened. The surface of the pool dropped, all at once, several inches in less than a second, and the witnesses on the bank could see the ring of wet rock above the new waterline, could see the exposed limestone and the creek moss hanging, and the water that remained in the pool was still and flat and dark, not tea-colored, dark. And Harlan was below the surface of it, and the preacher had his hands in that dark water, holding the child under. And then the water came back, up, not slowly, up, the way it had gone down, fast, in less than a second, back to its original level, and the surface broke up into rings, and Absalom Gentry pulled Harlan up, and Harlan surfaced. He did not gasp. He did not cough. He stood in the water with his arms at his sides and his eyes open, and his face completely calm, and he looked at Absalom Gentry, and he said, "And here I want to be very careful, because the witnesses give 3 different words, and the private letter gives a 4th, and I am going to read you all 4, and let you decide what you make of the discrepancy. 2 witnesses say Harlan said, 'It remembers.' 3 witnesses say he said, 'It knows now.' 1 witness, Ibby Turnbow, from her angle at the downstream bank, says he said nothing. She says he opened his mouth and she waited for words, and no words came, but that the water at the edge of the pool, at the point nearest her feet, moved toward her, against the current, about 4 inches toward her on the surface, in a thin sheet before it stopped. And Absalom Gentry, in the private letter, says that what Harlan said was the 4th thing, the thing none of the witnesses recorded, and that he has written it down because he could not carry it inside him, and he could not say it aloud, and he needed it to exist somewhere outside of himself. He says Harlan said, "Tell them what they gave it. Tell them what they gave it." The 5th change in the water happened after Harlan came out. After all, 4 children were on the bank, after the quilts were around them, and the congregation was beginning the slow settling back into ordinary motion. After, the witnesses say, it should have been over. Absalom Gentry was still in the water. He was wading back toward the stepping-off rock, thigh-deep in the pool, when the fifth change happened, and he is the only one who felt it from inside the water, and what he wrote about it in the private letter is the reason I have spent 8 months on this case. He felt the current reverse. Not stop. Reverse. The water that had been moving around him in the direction of the creek's flow, east, downstream, toward where the branch ran out of the valley, the water reversed and moved west, against its own flow, against the grade of the land, against everything water does. He felt it on his legs, both legs. A strong, purposeful movement, westward, toward the head of the valley, toward the ridge, toward whatever was above the still place and higher and older. It lasted, he wrote, about 4 seconds, and then it stopped. And the creek was the creek again. And he came out of the water and stood on the stepping-off rock and looked at the congregation, and they were looking back at him, and he said, in the voice he used for closing a service, "Let us go home." And they went home. And the valley went on the way it always went on. And the 4 children who had been baptized at Black Branch on the 14th of May, 1876, grew up in the briar pocket and lived their lives and died their deaths. And the creek kept running, and the still place kept its cold and its dark and its depth. And something changed in all of them, over years, not all at once, in ways that were not dramatic and were not individually inexplicable, but that taken together, across 4 lives, add up to something I have no ordinary word for. This is where the documentary part of this begins in earnest. I have given you the event. Now I want to give you what came after, because what came after is what makes the event mean something, and because the 4 children were the beginning of something, not the end. You're still with me. Good. Stay with me. We are going to go deeper. I told you at the start that there are 4 documents at the center of this case. I have named 2 of them, the letter from June Beckett's mother about the boy Harlan, and the circuit preacher's journal. The third is Absalom Gentry's private letter, and I have given you portions of it. The fourth is something I am not going to name yet, because its nature is part of the case, and because the way it arrived in the world is as strange as anything it contains. But I will tell you this. It was written by a woman who had lived on Black Branch for 30 years before Absalom Gentry arrived, and it was not found until 1922, and it was found in a place where it should not have been physically possible for it to be, and when it was found, it was dry. A document stored in a wet place for over 50 years, dry. Before we go there, and we are going there, I want to tell you about the years after the baptism, because the years are evidence, and evidence is what makes this more than a story. Cora Vestal was 9 years old on the 14th of May, 1876. She was 55 years old when she died in 1922. And in the 46 years between those 2 dates, she did 2 things that the people around her noted without understanding, and that I am going to lay out for you now in the plainest possible terms. The first thing, she never looked at her own reflection. Not mirrors, which I told you she had always avoided. Not windows at night, not the surface of still water, not the back of a spoon. She arranged her life, for 46 years, with a comprehensiveness and a practicality that strikes me as the work of a woman who understands that she is managing a real danger around the complete elimination of any surface that would show her her own face. Her daughter, a woman named Bertie, described this in a memoir she wrote for the County Historical Society in 1947. Bertie says her mother took her mirrors down when she moved in and stored them in the cellar, not dramatically, not as an eccentricity requiring explanation, but practically the way you store furniture you don't need. She says when Bertie herself was old enough to want a mirror, her mother bought her one and kept it in Bertie's room, and never entered Bertie's room without knocking first. She says her mother woke before dawn for 40 years, so that she was never standing at a window in the dark that could show her a reflection. She says she never understood any of this until she found the letter. The letter, not Absalom Gentry's letter. A letter Cora wrote to Edmund, her brother, in the winter of 1911, 35 years after the baptism. That letter is not one of the 4 documents. That letter is in a box in a county courthouse archive, and I have read it twice, and I am going to read you the relevant passage, which is 3 sentences. She wrote, "Edmund, I need you to tell me if it is the same for you. When I am near still water, I hear it, not a sound, something older than sound, like a name being said in a place where sound has not happened yet. I need to know if you hear it too, or if it is only me, and I need to know because I have heard it more often this winter, and it is getting closer to having a word. Like a name being said in a place where sound has not happened yet." That was written in 1911, and the fact that she wrote it tells us several things. She had not spoken of it to her brother in 35 years. She was beginning to be afraid that it was intensifying, and she believed, or feared, that it was moving toward articulation, that the thing she had been hearing near still water since 1876 was in the process of becoming language. Edmund Vestal's response to that letter does not exist in the archive. I have searched. It is not there. But there is a note in Bertie's memoir that says her uncle Edmund responded to the letter, and that after the response was received, Cora stopped going near still water entirely. She moved the water trough away from the house. She took her washing to a neighbor who had running water. She moved her kitchen to the south-facing room so that the window did not look toward the creek. She built her life, in the last 11 years of it, around the total avoidance of still water, and she kept counting things. This is the second habit, the one that the people around her found more notable than the mirrors. Cora Vestal counted everything, constantly, under her breath, not compulsively, not in the way of a person with a frightened mind, but steadily, routinely, the way you would count stitches or paces if counting were necessary to a task you were always performing. Bertie said her mother's lips moved constantly. She said you could watch her mother's lips when she was sitting still and see numbers forming, wordlessly, in no apparent order, and that when Bertie asked her about it as a child, Cora told her she was keeping track. "Keeping track of what?" Bertie asked. And Cora said, "What is mine? Of what is mine?" She was counting, in some fashion, across 46 years, a tally of herself. I offer that without explanation, because I do not have an explanation, only a theory, and I will tell you the theory when I tell you what Absalom Gentry eventually understood about the still place. But I want you to carry that image. A woman in a house with no mirrors, keeping her eyes from still water, moving her lips over account of something she never named, for 46 years. Edmund Vestal lived until 1931. He was 62 when he died. He spent most of his adult life in the valley, farming the same creek-bottom ground his father had farmed, and he was, by most accounts, an ordinary man in most respects. Quiet, reliable, the kind of man the community depended on without thinking much about. He had one extraordinary thing about him, and it was this. He was the best finder of water in 4 counties. Not a dowser, not exactly. He did not use a rod. He did not perform any ritual. He simply knew where water was. Underground water, hidden springs, the buried channels of old creek beds that had changed course decades or centuries before. He would walk over a field and stop and say, "There," and when people dug there they found water. He found water under 3 houses, 2 barns, and a church that had been built in the wrong place. He found water on a hillside that everyone in the valley had crossed 1,000 times without knowing it was there, and he found it by standing still and closing his eyes and tilting his head slightly to the right, the way a person tilts their head toward a sound they are not sure they are hearing. He never charged for this. He never made it a practice or a profession. When someone needed water, he came and found it and went home. When anyone asked him how he did it, he said he did not know, and when they pressed him, he said, "I feel where it is cold." Feel where it is cold. Underground water is cold the way the still place was cold, the cold of the earth's deep interior, the cold that has not touched sky in 1,000 years. Edmund Vestal, from the age of 7, felt where it was. His wife, A woman named Luli Vestal Gouter told a neighbor in about 1920 that her husband talked in his sleep. She said this without complaint as a simple biographical fact. She said he talked in his sleep in a voice that was not his, lower than his voice, slower than his voice, the voice of a man much older than Edmund was, or the voice of something that had learned to be a man. She said he said the same things repeatedly, and she had listened long enough to write some of it down, and when the neighbor asked what it said, Luli showed her the paper. What was on the paper, the neighbor said, was numbers. Long strings of numbers, 20 or 30 digits each, in groups. Like a count, the neighbor said, like someone counting a very large number of things, very carefully, in order. Like his sister moving her lips over her tally, like a count of what was theirs. I am going to come back to what that count might be, because I think I know, or I think Absalom Gentry knew and wrote it down in the private letter, and the answer is one of the most disquieting things in this case. But I want to give you Nettie Pruitt first, because Nettie's story is different from Cora's and Edmund's in a way that changes the shape of everything. Nettie Pruitt left the Briar Pocket Valley in 1883, when she was 18 years old. She went over the ridge to the north, to a town called Rafter, and she apprenticed herself to a physician there, a man named Silas Price, who took her on, initially because her mother Viola had trained her well enough to be useful, and kept her on because within 6 months it was clear that she was better at diagnosis than he was. She had, Doctor. Price wrote in a letter to a colleague in 1887, and this letter exists. It is in a university archive. It was written as a professional curiosity and not as testimony to anything strange. She had an ability he had not encountered in 30 years of practice. He wrote, "She knows. Before the examination, before the history, before I have opened my bag, she knows. She walks into a room where a patient is lying and she takes one breath and she knows what is wrong. I have tested this 40 times. I have deliberately withheld information. I have presented her with obscure presentations. She is correct every time. Not almost every time. Every time. She says she smells it. I asked her once what she smells, thinking she had some heightened sensitivity to the products of disease, some olfactory gift. She said, 'No, it is not a smell.' She said, 'It is more like knowing which way the water goes.' Which way the water goes. She felt the current of it. She felt the direction a body was moving, toward or away from health, the way Edmund felt the direction of cold water underground. She stayed in Rafter for 11 years, and then she left and went further out, to a larger town, and further still, and by the time she was 40 she was a trained physician in her own right, which was not an ordinary thing for a woman to be in Tennessee in the 1890s. And the record of her career is an ordinary professional record, patients and publications and the incremental building of a practice with one recurring note, in letters from colleagues and in her own correspondence, that appears too consistently to be coincidence. She always knew which way it was going to go. Not statistics, not probability. She would look at a patient and say, "This one will recover and that one will not." And she was right in a proportion that Silas Price, in his 1887 letter, had called every time, and that her own later correspondence suggests remained true. She did not talk about it publicly. She did not theorize about it. When asked, she said she had a feeling for the direction of things. She died in 1928 in a hospital in Nashville, and her effects included a small notebook, and the notebook has been in the custody of a university's special collections for 40 years, and I spent 3 days with it last spring. And what is in it is not what I expected. It is not a diary. It is not a case record. It is a list of names. The names are written one to a page, first name and last name, in Nettie's handwriting, starting from the front of the book and going toward the back, and there are 211 of them, and not one of them is the name of a patient or of anyone in Nettie's professional life that I have been able to identify. At the bottom of each page, under the name, there is a date. The dates are not in order. Some are old. The oldest is 1843. Some are recent, relative to Nettie's life, The most recent is 1921, 7 years before she died. And next to each date is a number, single digits, from 1 to 6. I spent 3 days trying to understand that notebook. I will tell you what I eventually understood. And when I tell you, it will connect to Cora's count and to Edmund's sleep-talking and to the marks on the limestone shelf at the still place, and to the thing. The woman who had lived in the valley 50 years told Absalom, Gentry, and all of it will connect to what happened to Harlan. But first I have to tell you what happened to Harlan, because Harlan is the center and everything else is the radius from him. After the baptism in 1876, Harlan stayed in the Briar Pocket Valley for almost exactly 2 years. He continued to rotate through households, always quiet, always useful, always arranged in whatever room he was in, so that he faced the direction of Black Branch. He grew, physically, the way children grow, and by the time he was 10, he was a normal-sized boy for 10, and nothing about his appearance was remarkable except the eyes and the stillness. In the winter of 1877, about 8 months after the baptism, he asked Absalom Gentry a question. This is in the private letter. Gentry records it with the care of a man who knew he was recording something he needed to keep exact. The boy came to him on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, while Gentry was splitting wood behind the parsonage. He stood and watched for a while, and then he said, "What did you give to the water?" And Gentry put his axe down and thought about it and said, "We gave it the children, in the way of the baptism, gave them to God, through the water." And Harlan said, "But what did you give to the water?" Gentry wrote that the distinction was clear. Not what did you give to God, what did you give to the water? And Gentry said he did not know how to answer, because he had not in his theology thought of the water as a recipient. The water was a medium. The water was a means. The water was not a thing you gave things to. And Harlan said, "It took something. From all 4 of us. I felt it go. I do not know what it took." And then he said, "I think it took the same thing from all of us. I think it took the same amount. I think it is keeping it." And he went back to whatever he had been doing, and Absalom Gentry stood in the woodyard with his axe and thought about a cold pool in a valley and what it might want that 4 children could give it. Harlan left the Briar Pocket in the spring of 1878. He was 10 years old, approximately. He left the way he had arrived, on foot, in the direction of the ridge, without explanation, without goodbye to anyone that anybody recorded. He was there one morning and gone by noon, and a search of the ridge and the hollow above it found nothing. He did not come back to the Briar Pocket, not in any form that was recognized or recorded, but he came back to Black Branch. That is the sentence I have been building toward, and I want to be very precise about what I mean by it, because I am not being poetic and I am not being vague. He came back to the water, not the valley, not the community, the water. Owen Cutts, the man who had found Harlan on the road above the still place in the winter of 1875, saw Harlan at Black Branch in the summer of 1884, 6 years after the boy had left the valley. Cutts was fishing upstream of the still place at a riffle about a quarter-mile above the bend, and he looked up, and on the far bank he saw a boy. A child, he said, 12 or so, which would be about right for Harlan at that age, standing at the water's edge and looking in. Not at the current, but at his own reflection, Cutts said. He called out. He called Harlan's name across the creek, because the light hair and the pale eyes were unmistakable. And the boy looked up, and Cutts said he said this to his wife, and his wife told a neighbor, and the neighbor was the grandmother of the woman who told me. He said the face was right. The face was the boy's face. But the reflection in the water was not the same face. He said the reflection looked older, not a little older, much older, adult, and that when the boy on the bank looked up, the reflection kept looking down at its own image in the water for a few more seconds. Then the boy on the bank walked into the water and did not come out on Cutts's side, and Cutts waded across, and he was gone, and there were wet prints on the bank going in and none coming out. This is 1910 now. If you will come with me, 34 years after the baptism, and I am going to take you to the 4th document, because the fourth document is what makes sense of everything I have just told you, and it is the most extraordinary thing in this case, and extraordinary is not a word I use lightly. In the summer of 1922, a flood came down Black Branch. Not a catastrophic flood, a 3-day rain that put the creek up 8 feet above its bank, covered the Deacon's Reach entirely, ran through the lower fields, and took out a fence and a pig shed and half the Cutts family's kitchen garden. This is documented in the county paper of August 26, 1922, in a brief item about flood damage on the south tributaries. When the water came down, in the flood's wake, a thing was uncovered at the base of the limestone shelf at the still place. The water had scoured the bank on the upstream side of the shelf, taken about 2 feet of accumulated silt and leaf mold off the base of the rock. And what was under it, wedged between the limestone shelf and a secondary rock that had fallen against it at some point in the deep past, in a crevice about 8 inches wide and 18 inches deep, was a tin box. A tobacco tin of a kind manufactured in the 1860s and 1870s, sealed, dry. Owen Cutts's son Luther found it. He was 22 and had grown up being told about the 4 children and the baptism and his father's sighting of Harlan on the bank in 1884, the way all the Valley children were told those things. As local history, that was also local warning. He pulled the tin out of the crevice and dried it on his shirt and opened it, and inside was a document. 47 pages of paper, handwritten, folded twice to fit the tin, completely dry, not foxed, not brittle, in good condition for a document that had been in a crack in a limestone creek bank for at minimum 46 years, and possibly much longer. The handwriting is a woman's hand, identified as such by a document examiner at the State University in 1963, who also estimated the paper and ink as consistent with the 1865 to 1875 period. The document is not signed. There is no name on it, no address, no date on the first page, but on the last page, after the last line of text, there are 3 words that serve as a signature. The 3 words are, "I give nothing." Who wrote it? Almost certainly a woman named Bess Corral, who had come to the Briar Pocket Valley in 1841 as a bride, 30 years before Absalom Gentry arrived, and who had lived on Black Branch for the rest of her long life. She died in 1893 at approximately 80 years old. She had lived in the valley longer than anyone else alive in 1876, and she was the woman Absalom Gentry describes in his private letter as the one he went to after the baptism when he finally understood that he needed to understand the water. He describes her as old beyond counting, which is a man's way of saying he could not tell her age. He describes her as a woman who had been on that creek so long she and the creek had grown past the point of having an ordinary relationship and into something that was more like an understanding between equals. He describes her as the person who told him what the still place was. And what the still place was, according to Bess Corral, is this. It was a door, not a metaphor for a door. A place where 2 kinds of ground met, 2 kinds of material reality, if you will, the quotidian ground we stand on, and some other ground that runs under it and beside it and through it in ways that only emerge at certain places, at certain cracks in the usual. She said, Gentry is quoting her in the private letter, in quotation marks, which he does not use casually. She said, "Some ground is thick, some ground is thin. The thin places are where things can go through and where things can come through, and the thin places are always near water because water is thin to begin with. Water is the thinnest thing there is, except for dark. Some ground is thick, some ground is thin." The still place on Black Branch was a thin place, and it had been a thin place since before the limestone shelf was laid down, since before the ridge was a ridge, since before there was a valley for a creek to run through. The people who left the marks on the limestone shelf, the marks that predated the church and the congregation and the arrival of anyone currently in the valley, those people had known it was thin and had marked it, had used it for their own purposes, at their own thin places in their own time, and had left when they left, and the thinness had remained, because thinness is not made by people and is not ended by them. And the thinness of the still place meant that when something went into that water, something alive, something with what Bess Corral called its full measure of itself still in it, the water did not merely contain it temporarily. The water registered it. The water kept a record, not of the body, of whatever it is that makes a body itself rather than some other body. The quality of self, the fact of a particular person, their shape in the world, their specific weight, the water kept that, said Bess Corral, and the keeping was permanent. And what the baptism did, full immersion, 4 children, the 14th of May, 1876, was make a deposit into that keeping. All 4 of them. Something that had been theirs went into the water and stayed. Not all of them. The word Bess used, which Gentry records carefully, was a tithe of self. A tenth of whatever constituted each of those 4 children as themselves, left in the water, registered and kept, irrevocably. And what came back with them, in the remaining 9/10 of themselves, was access, a kind of attention, a sensitivity to what the water knew, which was a great deal, because the water at that thin place had been keeping tithes for much longer than any living person could calculate. The access came differently to each of them, depending on what the 10th that stayed behind had been made of. Cora's was something that had to do with self-recognition, with the boundary of self, which is why she could not bear mirrors and why she spent her life counting herself back into herself. Edmund's was something that had to do with sensing what was below the surface, which is why he found water under the earth, and why the underground cold spoke to him. Nettie's was something that had to do with direction, with which way things were moving, which is why she knew which way a patient was going. And Harlan's tithe was the largest, Bess Corral told Gentry, not because more was taken, because Harlan had less to begin with. She said Harlan's measure was not full when he came to the water. She said most children come to baptism with their full measure and give a tenth. She said whatever that boy was, whatever he had been before he came to the briar pocket, something had taken most of his measure already, and what was left, the fragment he brought to the still place on the 14th of May, when the water took its tenth of that fragment, there was not enough left to bring back. And this is the place in Absalom Gentry's private letter where the handwriting changes, not dramatically. A slight alteration in pressure, a slight loosening of the usually careful letters, the writing of a man who is writing something he has been not writing for some time. He says, "I did not put a child into that water. I do not know what I put into that water." And then he writes the thing that Harlan said to him in 1877. "What did you give to the water?" And he says, I think I know what he was asking. I think he knew more of his own nature than he had, and I believe he is asking what I took from him by naming him in the baptismal rite. I think his name was the last of his measure. I think when I spoke his name over the water and put him under, I gave the water the last of what he was, and I think what came up was what had always been under the water and had never had a name until I gave it his. I think what came up was what had always been under the water, and I gave it his name. I want to sit with that for a moment, because the thing about Harlan, the thing about the boy who came from nowhere and had no family and no surname, and arrived in a valley in midwinter and oriented himself toward a creek at all times, the thing that Absalom Gentry, at the end of a long career of trying to understand it, concluded is that Harlan was not quite what he appeared to be. He appeared to be a lost child. He arrived as a lost child. He presented all the markers of a lost child, and the community responded to him as a lost child, with warmth and with care, and he accepted that care, and worked for it, and earned it. And none of that was false. He was a child. He was in some real sense what he appeared to be. But Bess Corral said, and Gentry believed her, that Harlan had come to that water on purpose, not consciously, not with a plan, not with intention in any human sense. The way water comes to a low place, because it is what water does, because the low place is where it belongs. Something in Harlan had been drawn to the still place from wherever it had come from, and had arrived in a child's body in the winter before a baptism year, and had waited in the valley, patient and still and quiet, until the 14th of May, and had gone into the water, and had given the last of what made it Harlan, and the water had received it. And what came up, wearing Harlan's face, wearing his pale eyes and his stillness, for the 2 years that it stayed in the valley, that was the water's answer. The water's version, the water's acknowledgment of the gift. She did not say what came up was not Harlan. She said what came up was not only Harlan. 2 things in one body. The trace of the child and the capacity of the water combined, something that was partly a 10-year-old boy from nowhere and partly the accumulated register of everything the still place had kept since before the limestone shelf was laid down. And when it left, in the spring of 1878, it went back to the water, because that is where it came from, and Owen Cutts saw it at the water's edge 6 years later, looking at itself in the surface, and the reflection it saw was not the boy's face, but the face of what it was becoming, which was older than the boy had ever been, and always would be. Tell them what they gave it. What they gave it, the 4 children, was a 10-part fraction of each of themselves, kept in the water, registered in the cold dark of a thin place in the earth. And what the water gave them back, the access, the sensitivity, the knowing, was interest on a deposit, a return on an investment they had not chosen to make. And the water kept its records. This is where Nettie's notebook comes in. The notebook with the 211 names and the dates and the single digits. I said the single digits ranged from 1 to 6. I said there were 211 entries over 70 years. The digit next to each name is the number of times that person was fully immersed in the still place. The dates are the dates of immersion. The names are not the names of the Briar Pocket congregation. They are the names, going back to 1843, of everyone who had ever been fully immersed in Black Branch at the Bend. They called the Deacon's Reach, or the Still Place, or some earlier name that predated the community entirely. Nettie Pruitt, dying in Nashville in 1928, knew who had been in that water, all of them. Back to 1843, which is as far back as the record went before the document in the tin box was found in 1922. She kept the list. She kept it in a notebook she did not show anyone, in a handwriting that was small and careful and utterly private. 211 people. 173 of them had a 1 beside their name, single immersion, baptized once. 31 had a 2, baptized twice, years apart, at 2 different points in their lives. 6 had a 3, 5 had a 4, 1 had a 5. One person in that notebook had a 6 beside their name. It is the last entry in the book. It is written in a different ink than the others, darker, applied more heavily, as if Nettie had pressed harder than usual. It is dated 1921, 7 years before she died. The name beside it is Bess Correll, who told Absalom Gentry about the thin places and the tithes and the water's register, who died in 1893. Who Nettie Pruitt could not have met, because Nettie had left the valley before she was old enough to have the conversation Gentry describes. Who had been immersed in the still place at Black Branch 6 times in her long life, and whose name Nettie wrote in the notebook in 1921, 28 years after Bess Correll was in the ground. Bess Correll, who had been immersed in the still place 6 times, who had given a tithe of herself 6 times to that water, and who had, by the end of her life, if Gentry's theory of the access, of the interest on the deposit, is correct, given so much of herself to the water that the remainder of her was very small, and the water's portion of her was very large, and the boundary between Bess Correll, the woman, and the thing Bess Correll had been keeping company with for 50 years was not as clear as it had once been. 6 times. You go into the water, and the water takes its tithe. Every time. And after 6 tithes, how much of yourself is left? What is the count at 6? If Cora Vestal spent her life counting what was hers, 1/10 down, making sure the 9/10 remained 9/10, what did Bess Coral spend her life doing at 6/10 remaining? At 50 years old, at 60, at 70, at 80, with more than half of herself in the cold, dark water of a thin place in the earth, registered and kept, and the water looking back at her through that register with something it was not quite possible to call a face? What was Bess Coral doing? At the end, when she stood at the still place and looked in, I think she was listening. I think the water had been talking to her for a long time, in a voice that was partly its own voice and partly the voice assembled from the tithes of the 210 other people it was keeping, and I think after 50 years of listening, she had gotten very good at understanding it, and I think the last thing she put in the tin box in the crevice of the limestone shelf was the account of what she had understood, and I think she left it there because she was afraid to take it out of the valley, and afraid to destroy it, and afraid to give it to anyone directly, and because she knew the water would keep it dry. The document in the tin box, the 47 pages, the woman's handwriting, the conclusion signed, "I give nothing," is not a complete account of the still place and its history. It reads more like a midpoint report. A woman halfway through a very long project, noting what she knows so far and what she suspects and what she has decided not to give, and explaining why. The "I give nothing" at the end is not a description of the document. It is a statement of intent. It is Bess Coral recording, in the water's keeping, through the document that the water will preserve in the crevice of its bank, that she has come to the limit of what she is willing to deposit, that there is 1/10 of herself she will not give, that the count stops here. The document describes the marks on the limestone shelf. I promised you those. The marks are, according to Bess Coral, not a record of the people who used the still place. They are a record of what the still place has taken. Every tithe, every immersion, going back as far as the marks go, which is further back than the marks on the limestone that anyone can date. The marks are a ledger, not of names, of measures, of fractions, of what was deposited and is being kept. And the total, she says, as best she has been able to calculate it from the marks and from the knowledge she has accumulated in 50 years of proximity, the total of what the still place keeps is very large. Enough tithes of self, from enough people, over enough time, that what the water has accumulated is not fragments, but something more nearly whole. A composite of gathered selfhood. A consciousness assembled from 100 partial donations. She says, "I believe it is listening. I believe it has been listening for a long time. I believe it is getting close to having enough to speak from, and I believe what it speaks will be in a voice assembled from the pieces it keeps. And I do not know whose voice that will be, and I do not think it will be a comfortable voice to hear. I believe it is getting close to having enough to speak from." She wrote that in approximately 1870, 6 years before the baptism of 4 children at the still place on the 14th of May, 1876, 6 years before the water went white and dark and backward and the level dropped, and Harlan said what he said, and Absalom Gentry felt the current reverse against his legs. 6 years before it got 4 more tithes in one morning. And now I want to tell you what happened in the valley after the baptism, the thing I have been building toward, the thing that explains why Cora Vestal counted, and why Edmund found cold water in the dark earth, and why Nettie knew which way the dying moved, and why Harlan came back to the water's edge in 1884 and looked at a reflection that was not entirely his. The still place kept changing, not visibly, not in any way that a passerby would notice. The water ran the way it ran, and the pool was the pool, and the hemlock trees on the bank shed their needles into the dark surface the way they always had. But the people who lived in the valley noticed. The people who had been close to the water, who had given it something, who had the access, they noticed. The cold went further. The zone of cold that had always stopped at the edges of the pool, the cold that Creed Alcorn had felt underwater in 1874. That was not the cold of mountain water, but the cold of something below. That zone expanded, gradually, over years. By 1885, according to 3 separate accounts in the valley, the cold came up out of the ground around the still place for about 20 feet in every direction. You could walk through it. You could step into it and step out of it, feel it go over you, and lift off when you stepped back. By 1895, it was 40 feet. By 1905, according to a man who surveyed the valley for the county that year and noted the anomaly in his report without knowing what to do with it, the cold extended about 100 feet in every direction from the pool, encompassing the stepping-off rock and the carving on the limestone shelf, and a section of the path that the congregation had used for a century to walk from the church to the water. The congregation stopped walking that path in 1902. The church dissolved as an organization in 1907 after Absalom Gentry died because he was the last thing holding it together, and without him, the people of the valley could not agree on how to relate to what was at the bend in the creek, and some of them wanted to fill it in, and some of them wanted to leave it, and some of them wanted to do something with it that nobody could articulate clearly, and the failure to agree is the most human thing in this entire case. Absalom Gentry died in December of 1907. He was 75 years old. He died in the parsonage, in the bed where he had slept for 46 years, and his death was ordinary in every external respect. He was old, and he had been sick, and he died. But his housekeeper, a woman named Dare Minton, was with him at the end, and she said one thing at the last minutes that I have not been able to set aside. She said he was not frightened. She said he was calm in a way that went beyond the calm of a man at peace with his God, the calm she had seen in other people dying and that she called settled. This was not that. This was, she said, more like a man who is concentrating very hard on listening to something very far away. She said his eyes were open, and he was not looking at the ceiling, and he was not looking at her, and he was not looking at anything in the room. She said he was looking at the wall that faced the creek. And she said, in the last clear moment before the end, he said something. She heard it. She repeated it to her daughter. Her daughter wrote it down in a letter in 1940, more than 30 years later, from memory. And the letter is in the County Historical Society archive, and I have read it. He said, "Now I will hear what it has learned. Now I will hear what it has learned." He died. And the water went on, cold and dark and keeping what it kept, and the tithes were in it, 1/10 of 4 children and fractions of 207 other people, and the 6/10 of Bess Coral, who had said, "I give nothing," and had meant it, mostly, and the water held all of it, the way water holds what you put into it, without judgment, without preference, because that is not how water works. Water does not judge what it keeps. It keeps. Are you still with me? Because we are not done. We are 3/4 of the way through this case, and the part I have not told you yet is the part that happened last. You need to know about 1959. In the summer of 1959, a geologist named Walter Pruitt, no relation to Nettie, or not a close one, the name was common in those counties, came to the Briar Pocket Valley as part of a state survey of limestone formations. He was 28 years old, out of the State University, doing a 6-county survey of karst topography. He spent 4 days in the valley and filed a report that is in the State Geological Archives and that I have read in its entirety. He describes the valley correctly. He describes Black Branch correctly. He describes the limestone formations correctly and with professional competence. He notes the still place. He calls it a pool at a meander bend, which is the correct geological term, and he notes the cold, and he notes the limestone shelf, and he describes the markings on it, and his description of the markings is the most precise description I have found anywhere. He says, irregular incised marks in the limestone surface, in no pattern consistent with natural erosion, covering an area of approximately 11 square feet. Marks range from simple lines to complex clustered configurations. Some configurations appear to use a consistent symbolic vocabulary, suggesting intentional system. Cannot date without extraction and laboratory analysis. Recommend further study. He did not recommend further study of the cold. He noted it as anomalous and moved on, because the cold is not his field, and he is a geologist, and a geologist has a report to file and 4 more counties to survey. He also, in the 4 days he was in the valley, went swimming in the still place. He mentions this in the report as a personal note, not a professional observation. He says, "Water is cold even in July. Clear. Good swimming. Clear." In July, with the sun on it, the still place was clear, not dark. Clear enough for a geologist from the State University to go swimming on a warm afternoon. He went in once. He does not mention what happened while he was in the water, and I believe he did not notice anything that he could categorize as notable. He went in, and he swam, and he came out, and he dried off, and he noted the temperature and went about his survey. But Walter Pruitt filed that report in September of 1959, and in September of 1959 he began keeping a journal. He had not previously kept a journal. He said so explicitly. On the first page, "I have never kept a journal before. I am not sure why I am starting now. It seems like a thing I need to do." He kept it for 22 years. I have large portions of the journal in photocopy because Walter Pruitt's widow donated his papers to the State University in the early 1990s, and a graduate student in the folklore department noticed the material about Black Branch and had relevant sections copied before the full donation was processed. The journal is, for the first several years, a record of an ordinary professional life, career progress, field work, marriage, the birth of 2 children, nothing remarkable, except he counted things. Beginning from the first page, he kept running tallies of small things: the number of steps between his parking spot and his office, the number of street lamps on his block, the number of tiles in the ceiling of the building where he worked, the number of windows visible from his kitchen. He did not hide this from his wife. He did not seem to think it was strange. He treated it as a preference, a form of idle attention, the kind of thing some people do with their hands in a waiting room. His wife told the graduate student in an interview in 1993 that she had thought nothing of it until the children were born, when she noticed that he counted them, not ominously, not in the way of an anxious parent checking on sleeping children. He counted them the way you count your change, the way you account for what is yours. He would come into a room where both children were and his lips would move, and then he would stop, making sure of the inventory, like Cora Vestal's lips moving over the count of what was hers, like Edmund's sleep-talking through long strings of numbers, like Nettie's notebook of tithes and dates. The tithe comes back in different forms. The access manifests differently in each person, but the counting is always there. The keeping of the account, the registration of what is owned and what is owed, because the water has taught them what it means to be kept, and the lesson was thorough. In his journal in the summer of 1968, 9 years after the swim in the still place, Walter Pruitt writes something that is the last of the 4 documents, in the sense that it is the most recent document that I am going to tell you about tonight, and the most direct. He is writing in summer and his family is asleep and he is at his desk, and he writes, "I heard something tonight. Not a sound. I don't have the right word for it. More like the awareness of a voice, in the way you are sometimes aware of a conversation happening in another room, not the words, just the shape of a voice speaking, low and very large, the way a deep bell is large, a bell the size of a building, something that doesn't sound like a bell, just carries that same sense of being much larger than the container that makes it. I have heard it twice before this year, in the same way, always at night, always when the house is quiet. I am not frightened. I do not know why I am not frightened. I should be frightened. I think I am not frightened because the sound, the shape of it, is familiar. I have heard the parts of it before. I cannot explain that better. I recognize it from its parts. I recognize it from its parts. The water assembled, the water speaking in a voice made from the fragments it kept, a tenth of this person, a tenth of that, the 6 tithes of Bess Correll, the fragment of the nameless child, all of it combined into something that had enough of itself to form a voice, and had been forming it for a long time, slowly, as it accumulated more, and Walter Pruitt, one swim in a cold pool 20 years old, heard the beginning of that voice in the night, and recognized it, and was not afraid, because the part of him that the water had kept was in that voice, and your own voice, heard from somewhere else, is not frightening. It is just your voice. He heard it again 5 times before he died in 1991. The last entry about it is in 1985. He writes, "It is clearer now. I can almost make out words, not in English, not in anything I know, but words, I think, or the shapes of words, the grammar of something, the grammar of something." He died of a heart attack in his bed in November of 1991 at 60 years old, and his wife said he had been peaceful that last year. In a way he had not always been peaceful, and that in the last weeks he had slept very deeply, and she had noticed he did not count any more in his sleep. He had stopped counting. The account was settled. And now I want to tell you the last thing, the thing that I have been turning over for 8 months, and that I have no way to make comfortable, and that I am going to give you as plainly as I can, and let you hold it however you need to hold it. I went to the Briar Pocket Valley. I went in April, which is the month before May, the month before the anniversary of the baptism. I went because I had the documents and I wanted to see the water, and because in this kind of work you go to the place if you can, and you stand in it, and you feel what there is to feel, and you try to be honest with yourself about the difference between what you feel and what you know. I went to Black Branch. I walked the path from where the church had been. The building is gone. The foundation stones are in the grass. You can see the outline of it, and I followed the creek upstream to the bend. The still place is still there. The pool is smaller than it was. The valley had a big flood in the 90s that moved a lot of material around, and the limestone shelf has more of the creek running over it than it used to. But the bend is there. The stillness is there. The cold is there. I walked into the cold zone at about 30 feet from the bank and felt it go over me, and it is exactly what the accounts say. Not a cold that comes from above, not the cold of a shaded place or a damp place. The cold of something below. The cold that lives in the earth and has not touched sky. I did not go into the water. I want to be clear about that. I stood on the bank, and I looked at the surface of the pool, and I looked at it for a long time, and here is what I am going to tell you about what I saw, honestly, without embellishment. The water was dark, darker than the upstream channel, darker than it should have been for a May afternoon in April, I mean a clear April afternoon. I mean good light, and it was still. And I looked at it long enough, and I looked at my own reflection in it long enough, and I want to be very honest with you about what I noticed. The reflection tilted when I tilted. But there was a delay. Not much. A fraction of a second. Not enough to be certain about. Enough to be uncertain about for a very long time afterward. I stepped back. I stopped looking. I have been counting things since I got home. Not compulsively, not anxiously. Just, I notice I am counting. The tiles, the steps, the windows on my block. Adding the running total to a number I have been maintaining, without deciding to maintain it, without writing it down anywhere, because it is in me somewhere and does not need to be written. My account with the water is very small. I did not go in. I looked at the surface for a few minutes, and I stepped back, and I went home. If the still place took a tithe of something from that, what it took was very small, a fragment of a fraction, barely enough to register. But water keeps what it keeps, all of it, for as long as the thin place holds, and the thin place at Black Branch has been holding since before the limestone shelf was laid down. I think Absalom Gentry was right. I think Bess Corral was right. I think the water at the still place is in the process of assembling something slowly over centuries from the pieces of the people it has kept, and I think it is getting close to having enough. I think it has almost found its grammar. And I think, on a morning in May, in 1876, 4 children stood at the edge of that assembly and gave it 4 more pieces, and one of them gave it something that the assembly had not had before, something that came from somewhere very old, wearing a child's face, and that the 5 changes in the water that morning were the water's response, its acknowledgement, its turning toward the voice that had finally given it the last thing it needed to begin finding words. I don't know what it will say when it finds them. I don't know if it has said it already, somewhere, in the deep of the night, in the ear of someone who went into that water and came out counting. I don't know if they have told anyone. But I know where you can go and look at a piece of still water on a warm afternoon. And I know that if you stand there long enough and look at your own face in it, you will notice whether your reflection keeps up, whether it keeps up. And if it doesn't, if it tilts just a half second after you do, if it hesitates at the edge of following you, I would ask you to do something for me. I would ask you to step back. Don't let the water complete the question it is asking. Don't give it the answer it is looking for, because some things are better kept than buried, and some things are better neither. Go to the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have a creek near you that runs darker than it should. Tell me if you have been counting things lately that you did not use to count. Tell me if there is a still place near you that feels thin. I read everything. The next case is already waiting. It involves a river in Kentucky that a man crossed twice in the same direction and arrived at different banks. It involves a court document filed in 1893 and the question of which version of a man is entitled to his property. It is not a comfortable case. Sleep with the doors barred tonight, and don't look too long at dark water. If you're still with me after all of this, after 3 hours in the dark, with the water and its keeping, drop something in the comments. Tell me you made it. Tell me you're still whole. I'll see you on the next one. Stay counted. Now, I want to go back to the valley in the winter of 1877, because I have told you about the baptism and about what came after in the lives of the 4 children, but I have not told you about what happened to the valley itself in the year between the baptism and Harlan's departure. And the winter of 1877 is important, because the winter of 1877 is when the people of the Briar Pocket began to understand that whatever had changed on the 14th of May, 1876, was not going to change back. The first thing anybody noticed was the fish. Black Branch had always held fish. Native brook trout in the cold headwater stretches, reed-eye bass in the lower pools, the usual community of minnows and crawdads that you find in any clear Appalachian creek. The still place had always been a good fishing hole. Not great, the cold was too extreme for most species to stay in the deep center, but good because the edges where the pool fed back into the main channel were the right temperature and held food, and the bigger fish knew it. In the fall of 1876, the fish stopped holding at the still place. Not just the pool. The reach of creek, from about 200 yards upstream to 200 yards downstream. The fish moved. Creek fish do not ordinarily move in the fall. Fall is when trout are feeding hard before the cold, when the bass are still active, when a man could expect to fish the still place any afternoon and come home with something. After the fall of 1876, a man could fish from the stepping-off rock to the downstream rifflay all day and come home with nothing. The fish were not gone from the valley. They were above the pool and below it, in numbers that seemed slightly larger than usual, as if the fish had redistributed themselves around a space they had decided not to occupy. A farmer named Gideon Mounts noticed this first and reported it to Absalom Gentry as a curiosity, and Gentry wrote it down in his diary, not the private letter, the diary, which is a separate document and which is held by the county library in the valley's successor county. And he noted it carefully, because Gentry was a man who noted things carefully, and because he was already watching. He was watching because of what had happened to him in the pool, the reversal of the current. 4 seconds of water moving west against its own grade. He had not told anyone about that. He had not written it in the church book. He had told Bess Coral because she was the only person he had told anything, and she had listened to him describe it, and then she had said, "Yes, that is what it does when it takes something it has wanted for a long time. It turns toward it. It has been turned east all its life. running downhill, the way water runs, and for 4 seconds it could turn the other way. He asked her what it had wanted that it had not had before, and she said, "A complete peace." She said the water had been accumulating pieces for centuries, but that everything it had taken had been a tenth, a partial, a fragment. She said the water had never had a complete self, not one intact, not a whole measure of a person, because no whole person had gone into that water without intention of coming back out. They all came back out. Even 6/10 of herself, she said this without drama, without apparent distress, was still 4/10 remaining. You always come back out with something, except, she said, if what goes in has almost nothing left to come back with. She said the boy, Harlan, was as close to a complete peace as the water had gotten, not a tenth given and 9/10 returning, something much closer to a whole. And what you build from a whole is different from what you build from fragments, more coherent, more itself, closer to having a voice. She said this in the winter of 1877, and Gentry wrote it in the diary the same day, and then in the margin next to the passage, in a different ink, written later, he added, "I wonder if she knew that, when she stood on the stepping-off rock and watched me put him under. I wonder if she had arranged it. I wonder if she had arranged it." This is the thing about Bess Corral that I have sat with the longest. She was not at the baptism. She is not listed among the 31 attendees. She is not a member of the congregation, or she is not listed as one. She lived in the valley, and she was known in the valley, and she had 50 years of relationship with the still place, and she was not at the ceremony on the 14th of May. She was not standing on the bank, but Harlan had been staying with a family whose property was adjacent to hers in the winter of 1875 and 1876. Adjacent, and Harlan, who always arranged himself in the direction of the water, would have been arranging himself in the direction of Bess Corral's land. And Bess Corral, who had given 6/10 to the still place and had more access to what the water knew and wanted than any other living person in that valley, would have been able to look at that quiet child with the pale eyes and the orientation toward the creek, and understand something that nobody else in the valley understood. She would have known what had come to her neighbor, and she would have known what it needed. I am not saying she caused it. I am not saying she walked Harlan to the ceremony and put him in the water. I am saying the alignment of things is notable, and that Absalom Gentry noticed it, and that his notation in the margin of his diary is the only direct suggestion anyone ever made that what happened on the 14th of May was not entirely an accident. I give nothing, she wrote at the end of the document in the tin box. Not, I gave nothing. I give nothing. Present tense. A statement of ongoing intent made at the end of a life, to the water that was reading it. I think she was drawing a line. I think she was saying to whatever was building itself in the still place, I helped you. I stood nearby while you found what you needed. I have given you 6/10 over 50 years. But this is the end. I will not be the one who gives you enough to speak. I will not be the complete peace. There are other people in this valley. There are other people who are going to go into that water for reasons that have nothing to do with what I know. But not me, not the last of me, not the last 10th. She drew a line, and she put it in a tin box, and she wedged it in the limestone, and the water kept it dry for 60 years, because the water keeps what it is given, and that document was the last thing she gave. Now, I want to come back to Edmund Vestal and the cold water, because there is something about Edmund's story I have not told you yet, and it connects to Harlan's return to the creek bank in 1884 in a way that I think is essential. Edmund Vestal found water in the ground for 40 years. He stopped in 1917, when he was 48 years old, and he stopped suddenly, not gradually, on a specific day that his wife Lulie recorded in a letter to her cousin. Edmund came in from a surveying job. He had been asked to locate a well site for the County Road Commission, and he sat down at the table and he said, "It's gone." She asked what was gone. He said, "The cold, the thing he felt in the ground that told him where the water was." "Gone," he said, "like a lamp out." He was not distressed, she said. He was thoughtful. He sat there for a while, and then he said, "I suppose I know why." She asked him why. He did not answer directly. He said, "How long does it take a vine to come off a wall? If you want to take the vine off the wall, and let the wall be the wall again." She did not understand this, and she said so, and he said, "The vine is off now. The wall is just a wall again." I think what happened in 1917 is that the thing that had been in the still place, the presence, the accumulating assembly of what the water kept, released its hold on the access it had granted Edmund at the baptism, or the access expired, or the fragment of Edmund that the water held had been so thoroughly incorporated into the whole that the channel between it and the rest of Edmund had grown too long, too diffuse, too thin to carry the signal any more. The vine was off the wall. Edmund was just Edmund again, at 48, and the gift was gone, and the cold that had spoken to him underground since he was 7 years old was no longer speaking, and he sat at the kitchen table and thought about why, and decided he understood, and kept the understanding to himself. His wife said he slept easily after that. No more long strings of numbers in the dark. No more slow accounting in the small hours. He slept like a man who has finished a very long calculation and found it balanced. He died in 1931. His wife outlived him by 12 years and died in 1943. And the last thing she is recorded as saying to a neighbor who was with her was something about Edmund. She said, "He had a good long time of ordinary after. I think he felt he had earned it. I think he had earned it." Now, I want to come back to Cora, because Cora's story does not end the way Edmund's does, and the difference between them tells you something important about how the water distributes its attention. Edmund's access was sensory. He felt what the water knew. When the vine came off the wall, the sensory access went with it, and he was left ordinary, and that was apparently enough. Cora's access was something else. Cora's tithe was taken from whatever governed self-recognition, self-location, the sense of where you end and not you begins, and that kind of loss does not heal the way a sensory gift can be gently withdrawn. You cannot give back the sense of boundary by cutting the vine. She spent her life counting herself because the boundary was thin, because the baptism had thinned it, and the thinness was permanent, and she managed it the way you manage a structural weakness in a wall, not by repairing it, because you cannot repair it, but by shoring it up, monitoring it, never forgetting that it is there. In the last years of her life, she died in 1922, the same year the tin box was found, the same year Nettie wrote Bess Coral's name in the notebook in the darker ink. Cora Vestal became very difficult about water, not afraid of it, specific about it. She required that any water in the house be covered when not in use, not the bucket turned over the way Mercy Pettigrew turned her bucket, but covered, cloth over the top, weighted so that the surface was blocked from any possibility of reflection. She required that the windows be curtained on all sides after dark. She moved her bedroom to the interior of the house, the room with no exterior windows. She had her food brought to her in the last months, rather than coming to the kitchen where the window could catch the night. Her daughter Bertie describes this in the Historical Society memoir as her mother becoming very particular about the dark, which is a kind way of putting it. Bertie does not record any explanation for it. She records only that her mother was particular and that she respected it without fully understanding it, and that after her mother died she found, folded inside the Bible on the bedside table, a piece of paper with a single sentence on it. The sentence was, "If you hear your own name from a direction that is not a person, count to 3 and say it back to yourself, and keep counting." Bertie did not understand what this meant, and she left it in the Bible. She mentions it in the memoir as a last piece of motherly strangeness, the kind of instruction that made sense to the person who wrote it and perhaps to no one else. I understand what it means. By the last years of her life, Cora Vestal was hearing the water speak, not the way Walter Pruitt heard it 40 years later in 1968, not as the shape of a voice in the distance, closer than that, from the direction that was not a person, from the direction of the still place, which was about a mile from her house, which should have been too far to hear anything. It was using her name, not her name in a stranger's voice. Her name in a voice assembled from what the water kept, which included a tenth of her own voice, which meant the water was saying Cora in a voice that included Cora's own voice as one of its components, saying her name in a sound that was partly herself. And her answer to that, her management of it, her coping ritual, developed over decades of keeping her boundary, was to count, and to say her own name back to herself, and to insist by that act of self-assertion on the 9/10ths that remained hers. I am Cora Vestal. I am 9/10ths present. The 10th that is in the water is not a door. I am not opening a door. I am counting. She died at 55, which is not old. The cause of death listed is heart failure, which in 1922 covered a range of things it might more precisely have named. Bertie says she died quietly, in the curtained room, in the afternoon, and that she had been peaceful in the last hours, which is the same thing that Gentry's housekeeper said about Gentry, and that Walter Pruitt's wife said about Pruitt. Peaceful, in a way that was not quite ordinary peacefulness. The peacefulness of someone who has stopped having to maintain the count, because the count has reached its conclusion. And now, I want to close this loop, and give you the last thing, and then let you go. The closing of the loop begins with a letter. There is a letter written in the summer of 1947 from a man named Calvin Trent to the State Historical Society. Calvin Trent was a schoolteacher in the Briar Pocket Valley. The valley had been renamed twice by then, but the people who lived there still called it the Briar Pocket. The way people hold on to old names for old places, and he had been teaching in the Valley School for 6 years and had been collecting local history as a hobby, the way school teachers in small communities often do. He had interviewed the older residents. He had found some of the documents. He had pieced together most of what I have told you tonight, though his version was incomplete in ways that the later discovery of additional material has addressed. He wrote to the State Historical Society because he wanted someone with more resources to take the case seriously, and the Historical Society wrote back with a polite letter about priorities and limited staff, and Calvin Trent filed both letters in a folder and kept teaching, and died in 1961. And his papers went to the county library, where a librarian named Francis Hooper cataloged them and put them in a box in the basement and filed a finding aid. But before he died, Calvin Trent did one more thing. He went to the still place. He was not afraid of the water. He had grown up in the valley, and he knew the stories, and he was a school teacher with a rationalist's disposition, and he went to the still place in the spring of 1953, and he stood on the bank, and he looked at the pool. He describes this in a private notebook, not the letter to the Historical Society. He says the cold was present at about 30 feet, which is consistent with the accounts from earlier decades. He says the pool was dark. He says the markings on the limestone shelf were clearly artificial and clearly old, and that he counted them, without meaning to start counting, and he got to 37 distinct marks before he lost track and had to start over. He started over and lost track again at 43. He started a third time. He kept meticulous track on a piece of paper, marking each one as he went. He finished the count. There were 51 marks. Not approximately 51, exactly 51, in 3 groups, a group of 30, a group of 14, and a group of 7. Uneven spacing between the groups, as if they had been added at different times. He stood on the bank and counted 51 marks on the limestone shelf, and then he looked at the pool for a while longer, and he writes about what he saw in a way that I want to read to you exactly. He writes, "I looked at my reflection in the water for a long time, longer than was comfortable. I was trying to establish whether what I had heard about the reflection, the lag, the delay, was a matter of physics or of perception. Water under certain conditions can create optical distortions. The dark color of the tannin makes the reflection murkier than a clear pool. I did not necessarily expect to see anything anomalous. I was standing very still, watching. And then he writes, I blinked. And the reflection blinked. But then it blinked again. Once more, after I had stopped. As if it had extra. As if it had extra. He stepped back. He put his notebook in his pocket. He walked back up the path to the road, and he stopped counting at 37 steps and then started again from 1. And he noticed himself doing it, and he thought, there it is. And he kept going. He taught school in the Briar Pocket for the remaining 8 years of his life. He did not go back to the still place. He filed the letter to the Historical Society, and he kept his private notebook, and he died, and his papers went to the county library, and Francis Hooper put them in a box. And then I came along, and I read everything, and I went to the still place, and I stood on the bank, and I have been counting since I got home. I told you that at the beginning of the back half of this case, and I am going to tell you again here, near the end, because I think it is the most honest thing I can offer you. I stood at the water's edge, and I looked into the still place for a few minutes, and I stepped back, and I went home, and I have been counting since I got home. Not compulsively, not with distress, with the quiet persistence of something that has been set in motion and does not know it has been set in motion, the way you find yourself humming a song hours after you heard it without knowing why. A tenth of something very small is very small indeed. And I do not think the water noticed me, particularly. I think the water was busy being the water, dark and cold and keeping what it keeps. I think I stood on the bank of a thin place in the earth and looked into it, and the looking was probably not enough. But the counting has not stopped. And I want to ask you something before I let you go tonight. I want to ask you, honestly, right now, have you been counting anything lately? Have you found yourself aware of numbers in a way you were not aware of them before? Tiles and steps and windows and the inventory of small things around you? If you have been, and if you remember going near still water, I am not telling you to panic. I am not telling you that you are in any danger. The count is very small if the water only had a few minutes and a few feet of distance to work with. Cora Vestal managed her count for 46 years. Edmund let his vine come off his wall after 40 years and lived ordinary. Even Walter Pruitt, who went swimming, found his way to peacefulness in the end. The account can be kept. The boundary can be maintained. You just have to know it is there. You just have to keep counting. And if you hear your own name from a direction that is not a person, say it back, out loud, to yourself. Say it 3 times if you want to be sure. Insist on the 9/10ths that are yours. The 10th that the water might have touched is the water's business. The rest is yours, and you need to act like it. That is what Cora Vestal learned in a lifetime and left in a Bible. That is the whole of the survival ritual. So simple it sounds like nothing, so specific that she had to write it down. Now I need to tell you one more thing. The last thing. The thing I have been putting off. In the spring of this year, not 1876, not 1953, this year, a woman who lives in the valley called me. She had found the podcast, or the early version of this case that I put out in audio, and she had listened to it, and she called me. She lives on the south-facing slope of the ridge, about half a mile from the still place, and she had lived there for 20 years. She knew the creek, the way you know any creek that runs near your house, as background, as ordinary, as the sound you stop hearing because it has always been there. She called me because of something that had happened the previous November. She had been walking the creek bank on a cold afternoon, just walking, the way you walk near water when you need to clear your head. She passed the bend. She looked at the pool. She did not go in. She did not stay long. She walked on. That night she could not sleep. Not from anxiety, she said, from listening. She lay in her dark house, and she listened to the creek. The way you lie in a strange house and listen to unfamiliar sounds, except that this was not a strange house and the creek was not unfamiliar. She was listening to a voice. Not a voice in the creek. A voice that was using the creek's sound the way a speaker uses a microphone. The creek noise as the medium through which a voice was being carried, the voice organized in the rhythm of the water, in the spaces between the rush and the gurgle, in the patterns that you don't notice until you're listening for them, and then you can't not hear them. She said it was low. She said it was very large, the way you can have a large sound even when it is quiet. She said it had the quality, she reached for this comparison, and I thought it was precise, of a voice that had been practicing for a very long time and was not quite fluent yet, like someone speaking a language they have learned from reading and never had a chance to say aloud. She said she listened for about an hour, and then she said something that I have been sitting with ever since, and that I am going to give you straight, without interpretation, and let you make of it what you will. She said, "It said my name, not my whole name, just my first name, once. And it sounded like it was asking whether the name fit, like it was trying it on, like it was deciding." She said, "I said yes before I knew I was going to," and the voice stopped. She has been sleeping fine since then. She has not noticed anything unusual. She has not been counting, as far as she knows. She walked the creek bank again in December and in February, and the pool looked ordinary both times, cold and dark and still. But she called me to ask if she had done the wrong thing. She called me to ask if saying yes was the wrong answer. I told her what Cora Vestal left in the Bible. I told her to say her own name back to herself when the water says it. I told her to count what is hers. I told her what I'm going to tell you. You are not the water's. You are your own. The water keeps what it is given, and it has not been given you. And if you stand at the edge of a thin place, and it tries your name on to see if it fits, say your own name back. Out loud. Insist on it. The water is patient. It has been patient for a very long time. It will wait. But patience is not inevitability, and time is not the same as permission. And the still place on Black Branch has been accumulating for centuries, and it has not yet found its complete voice. And on the 14th of May, 1876, 4 children were brought to the deep pool at the bend, and the water was changed 5 times, and something that had come from somewhere very old and very far away went into the cold dark of a thin place in the earth, and said its name there for the first time, and the water heard it, and kept it, and built from it. And the building continues. That is the case. That is what I know and what I have found, and what I have been unable to stop thinking about since April of last year, when I first found the Circuit Preacher's Journal in a university archive and read the account of Ibby Turnbow and The Reflection of a Different Sky. The comments are open. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have a still place near you. Tell me if you have been counting. Tell me what your reflection does. I will read every one. Sleep with the lights on tonight if you need to. The dark is fine. The dark is just the dark. It is the still water that you want to be careful of. The next case is waiting. A river, a man, 2 crossings, and the question of which version of a person the court should believe. I will see you in the dark. Stay counted. Stay yours. But before the next case, I want to stay with this one a little longer, because there are threads I have not pulled all the way through, and threads that go somewhere unexpected, and you have been with me this long, and you deserve the full length of it. Let me go back to the document in the tin box, the 47 pages in Bess Coral's hand, because I gave you the headline of it, the thin places, the tithes, the assembly. But the document contains things I have not told you about yet, and the things I have not told you change the shape of what happened on the 14th of May in a way that matters. The document begins not with the still place, but with a river. Not Black Branch. A different river, further north, in Virginia, whose name she does not give. She refers to it only as the Northern Water, and a crossing that she describes as having taken place before she came to the Briar Pocket, before 1841, in a time she marks as when I was very young and did not know yet what I knew. She crossed the Northern Water once, she says, at a ford that the local people called the Thin Ford, for reasons she did not understand at the time and did understand later. She crossed it in the morning, eastward, going somewhere. She arrived on the far bank in the afternoon. She had been in the water for perhaps 40 seconds, waiting, the current strong at mid-crossing, and calmer at the near bank. She arrived on the far bank in the afternoon, having left the near bank in the morning. Not the afternoon of the same day, the afternoon of a different day. A day she could not account for, could not reconstruct, could not find in herself. She had left the near bank in one morning and arrived on the far bank in a different afternoon, with a gap of something between 20 and 30 hours that did not exist in her memory. She does not make a great deal of this. She records it plainly, the way you record weather. It rained. I crossed the ford. A day and more was missing, without drama. Because for Bess Corral, at the time of writing, this was context, not revelation. This was the beginning of the education that had led to the 50 years at Black Branch, the 6 tithes, the document in the tin box. The thin ford had taken something from her. Not a tithe. She does not use that word for it. She says, the ford took what I could not hold. And she says, I think it looked for something in me that it recognized, and when it found it, it took it. And I spent 40 years at Black Branch understanding what it had found, and what I was without it, what the ford found in her, what it recognized, what it took. She comes back to this near the end of the document, and her answer is something I want to read you exactly, because it is the part of the document that the document examiner in 1963, who was a careful and literal-minded man, wrote in his notes. I do not know what to make of this passage, and I do not think it would be appropriate for me to reproduce it in the public summary. It is appropriate. I am going to tell you. She says, I think what the thin water recognizes is not a person but a quality, a kind of porousness. Some people are made closer to the surface than others. The surface of them is thinner than the usual. In a person built with thin boundaries, the ordinary everyday self, the version you run your life with, the version that answers to your name and makes your decisions and goes to sleep at night and wakes up in the morning, is closer to the other version, the version underneath, the one that has been there since before you were born. Some people are built with a wall between those two versions, a thick, comfortable wall, and they never know the underneath version is there at all, and they live their lives and die, and that is all. And some people are built with a membrane instead of a wall, and the thin water finds the membrane, and the thin water goes through. The thin water goes through. She says she thinks what the thin ford found in her was the membrane. Not porousness as a flaw or a weakness. She is clear about this, and she says it more than once, and I think she means it, as a quality, a characteristic. The way some people have a gift for music and some people are tone deaf, and neither is wrong, just differently equipped. And she says she spent 50 years at Black Branch understanding that the membrane she had was the same membrane that the still place was interested in, and that the membrane is what passes the tithe in both directions, not just what the water takes in, but what the access is, on the return. The channel goes both ways through the thin boundary. The water takes its tenth through the membrane, and the awareness flows back through the same opening, which means the more the membrane is used, the thinner it gets, which means 6 tithes, over 50 years, had not just taken 6/10 of Bess Corral's measure from her. They had made the remaining 4/10 increasingly permeable, increasingly available to what was on the other side of the membrane. And in the last pages of the document, the pages she wrote last, the ink darker and the handwriting slightly larger, as if she were having some difficulty with the close work, in those last pages she describes what she means by the other version, the version underneath, the one that the thin water speaks to. She says, I believe every person who comes to consciousness in a body arrives from somewhere that is not here, and carries something of that somewhere with them, and that this carried thing is not accessible in ordinary life, because the body and its concerns occupy the foreground completely. She says, I believe that somewhere is thin in the same way that the thin places are thin, that the place before the body is as thin as the still place, and that what passes between the two is the same membrane, looked at from both sides. She says, "When the thin water took 1/10 of me, what it took was 1/10 of the connection between my body and my before, not something I use, not something I access in daily life, but something that was mine. And when it gave back the access, the sensitivity, the knowing, what it gave me was the ability to feel the before of things, not mine, the before of everything near me. The before that runs under the quotidian, the way the cold runs under the still place. I can feel it the way Edmund Vestal's son felt cold water underground. I am not speaking with it. I am feeling that it is there." This is the most extraordinary passage in the document, and it is the passage the examiner declined to reproduce, and I understand why, and I am reproducing it anyway because I think Bess Corll earned the right to have it taken seriously. What she is describing is the ability to feel the deep substrate of things, not past or future, not the content of experience, but the before experience that underlies everything, the condition that makes experience possible. And she is saying that the still place, by taking its tithes, had given her increasing access to that substrate, and she had decided to stop. Not because she was afraid. She says that explicitly, "I am not afraid." She says she is stopping because she can see clearly now what the assembly is building toward, and while she does not believe it means harm, she believes that some things are better not completed, that the thing that is assembling in the water, the consciousness that is being built from 207 tithes, from 100 years of registrations in a thin place, that thing, when it has a voice, will not speak with malice, but will speak with an authority that no living person is equipped to manage. And she has already, by giving it 6 tithes and 50 years of proximity, contributed more to its assembly than any other single person in the valley's history, and she is stopping because she sees the completion of what she has helped build, and she is not prepared to be the one who completes it. "I give nothing." She draws the line with the water watching. Now, there is a passage in the document near the middle that describes something she calls the second change, which is not the same as Absalom Gentry's second change at the baptism. Her second change is different. It is a change she observed in the valley over the decades she was there, a change in what the thin places do to the people who live near them for a long time without the membrane protection that she had. She says, "Ordinary people, people with the usual wall instead of a membrane, are not immune to the thin places. They are not taken through in the way I was taken through, or the way the children were taken through on the 14th of May, but they are changed. Slowly, by proximity, by living in the field of a thin place the way you might live in the field of something that generates heat. You do not notice it day to day, but over years you are different than you would have been elsewhere. Your sleep changes. Your attention changes. Small sensitivities develop that you cannot account for. You begin to feel the weight of the air above still water." She says, "I believe all the families of this valley are somewhat changed. Not in the dramatic way of the membrane people, in the quiet way of water on stone. The stone does not choose to be shaped by water, but it is shaped. The families of the Briar Pocket Valley in 1876 were not, any of them, unchanged by proximity to the still place. The Vestals, the Prewetts, the Cutts family, the Beckett family that housed Harlan that winter, Gideon Mounts and his fish observation, all of them, over years and generations, slowly permeable, slowly in conversation with the thin place in their midst, without knowing it was a conversation, without knowing there was a thing to be in conversation with. This is why the community kept to itself. Not insularity, exactly, though it looked like insularity from outside, something more like magnetism. The thin place held them. They came back to it even when the rational thing was to leave. They told the stories to their children not to frighten them, but because the stories were true and the children needed to know them, and in telling the stories they reinforced the relationship, and the relationship made the stories more true, and the cycle ran for generations. Absalom Gentry came to the valley in 1861, and he stayed for 46 years, and he came from outside, and yet he stayed. The thin place held him too. Eventually, by the time he was writing the private letter, he was held as firmly as any family that had been there for 3 generations. He knew it. He says so in the letter, near the end. He says, "I came to this valley a stranger, and I will die in it because the water knows me now, and I know it. And we have an understanding that is too old and too deep to walk away from, even if I wanted to, and I am no longer sure I want to." He died in the parsonage in the winter of 1907, and his last words were about hearing what the water had learned. He did not regret it. That is what I have carried away from his account more than anything else. He did not regret it. He had spent 26 years trying to understand what had happened on the 14th of May, and he had arrived at the end at something he thought of as understanding, and the understanding included his own place in it, and he was at peace with his place. Now I want to give you the testimony of the last living witness to the baptism. There was one. Her name was Dana Birdsong, born Dana Alcorn, daughter of Creed Alcorn, the boy who felt something move past him underwater in 1874. And she was 5 years old on the 14th of May, 1876, and she had been brought to the still place that morning by her mother, who was among the 14 witnesses. Dana Alcorn Birdsong was interviewed by Calvin Trent in 1951 when she was 80 years old, and he was trying to build his historical account of the case. She was lucid and specific and willing to talk, and the interview is in Calvin Trent's papers in the county library, and it is the best contemporary witness account we have, because everyone else who had been there as an adult was long dead. She had been 5. She had been held in her mother's arms on the bank. She had not, of course, understood what was happening in any theological or cosmological sense. She had seen a ceremony at a creek and 4 children going in and out of the water. But she had seen the children up close. Her mother had brought her forward to see. And what she remembered, at 75 years later, about the 4 children after the baptism, was one thing. She remembered that they all looked surprised. Not frightened, not transformed in any visible way, just surprised. The way a person looks when something has happened to them that they did not expect to feel as strongly as they felt it. The quiet surprise of an expectation not met by what actually occurs. She said, "I did not know what baptism was supposed to feel like. I was 5. But I thought it was supposed to feel one way, and from their faces it felt another way entirely, and none of them had words for the way it felt, and none of them tried to find words. They just stood there in the quilts, looking surprised." She said, all 4 of them. The same face. Even the quiet boy, the one with the light eyes, even he looked surprised. And I thought about it later when I was older and understood what I was looking at, and I thought, what surprised that boy was the same thing that surprised the others. The water surprised them. The water did something none of them had expected. And she said, I think what surprised them was that it said something. I think the water said something that surprised all 4 of them. I asked her, Calvin Trent asked her, what she thought it said. And she said, I think it said their names. I think that was the first time any of them had heard their names from a voice that wasn't human, and I think it surprised them because they recognized it anyway. Because it was using pieces of their voices to say their names. Because you always recognize your own voice. You always recognize your own voice. I want to go back to something. I want to go back to the moment that I have been circling without landing on, because I have been saving it for here, and here is where it belongs. On the 14th of May, 1876, Absalom Gentry stood in the still place after all 4 children had been baptized, and he put his hand into the water. Not for any ritual reason, because he wanted to touch it. He had just felt the current reverse against his legs, and he had come out of the pool, and he had stood on the stepping-off rock and looked at the congregation, and before he said, "Let us go home," before he composed himself, he reached down and put his right hand into the water. He describes this in the private letter with great care. He says, I wanted to know what it felt like now, after, whether it had changed. And he says, It was cold. The usual cold of the still place, the cold from below, the cold of deep earth. And then it was less cold, just for a moment, a few seconds, not warm, not anything like warm, but less cold, as if the cold had been on its way somewhere and had stopped briefly to consider something. He says, it felt like a hand, not a hand in the water, a hand that was the water itself, that was the temperature and the pressure and the dark of it, taking note of my hand the way you take note of a handshake, a formal acknowledgement. He says, I pulled my hand back. And then he says the thing that I have kept for last. He says, I thought afterward that I should not have put my hand in, that the water was now going to count me too. And I was right. I have been counted ever since. I do not know by how much. I do not know what fraction, but there is a portion of me in that water now, and has been since the 14th of May, 1876, and I can feel where it is, the same way I can feel the location of my hand when my eyes are closed. I know where it is, and sometimes, late at night, I know that it knows where I am. He put his hand into the water, and the water knew him, and he spent 30 years in the valley with a portion of himself in the still dark pool at the bend of Black Branch, and he died at peace with it, listening for what it had learned. And now the count is mine a little too, and I have been walking around with my own small contribution to it since I stood on that bank in April and looked into the still dark water for longer than I meant to. And if you have been listening to this for 3 hours, if you have been in this with me, in this valley, in this creek, in this cold, then the count might be yours a little too. Not because you went into the water, because you looked at it with me, because you held the names and the faces and the 4 children and the cold and the darkness of the pool in your mind for 3 hours, and some things, held closely and for long enough, leave their mark on you the way water leaves its mark on limestone, slowly, without drama, permanently. I am not trying to frighten you. I am trying to be honest with you. The still place is a thin place, and you have been near it for 3 hours, and I cannot tell you that is nothing. What I can tell you is what Cora Vestal left in her Bible. What I can tell you is to count what is yours and say your name back when you hear it from a direction that is not a person. What I can tell you is that the water has been building toward a voice for a very long time, and that voice, when it fully finds its words, will be strange and large and assembled from pieces of 100 people, and that the grammar of it will be like no grammar you have studied, and that it will mean something, and that you may or may not be ready for what it means. But you will recognize your own part of it. You always recognize your own voice. That is the case. That is everything I know about Black Branch, and the 14th of May, and the 5 changes in the water, and the 4 children who stood at the edge of something that has been building since before the limestone shelf was laid down. That is Absalom Gentry and Bess Coral and Harlan, with his pale eyes and his orientation toward the creek, and his last question, tell them what they gave it. That is Cora counting, and Edmund finding cold water in dark earth, and Nettie knowing which way the dying moved, and the notebook with 211 names written in it over 70 years. That is the still place. And I am going to go now, and you are going to go, and the creek is going to keep running, and the pool at the bend is going to keep being cold and dark and still, and the water is going to keep keeping what it keeps, the way it always has, the way it has been doing since before any of this had a name. And somewhere in that keeping there are pieces of 100 people, and a fragment of something that came from very far away and left its name in the water, and the count that Cora Vestal maintained for 46 years, and the last willful refusal of a woman who stood at the edge of the assembly she had helped build and said, I give nothing, and meant it, and put the document in a tin box in a crack in the limestone, and let the water keep that too. And whatever the water is building from all of it, whatever voice is being assembled in the cold dark of a thin place in the earth, out of 100 tithes and a child's name, and 50 years of Bess Coral's proximity, and the 4 seconds of reversed current on a May morning in 1876, that voice is getting closer to its words. and when it finds them, it will say them in a place where sound has not happened yet. And somewhere, someone who went into the right water at the right time will hear it, and they will recognize their own voice in it, and they will not know whether to answer. Tell me in the comments where you are tonight. Tell me what your still water looks like. Tell me if you have been counting. I will be here. Sleep with the doors barred, and watch what your reflection does. There is one more thing I need to tell you. I have been putting it off for the same reason people put off the last thing in any long accounting, because the last thing changes everything that came before it, and once I say it, you will never hear this case the same way again. It is about the still place, not the still place at Black Branch, about still places in general. There is a researcher at a university I am not going to name. I will call her Dr. Anand, which is not her real name, but is not chosen randomly, who has been working on something she calls the geography of thin places for about 20 years. She is a folklorist by training and a phenomenologist by inclination, and she has been cataloging for 2 decades the sites across the American Southeast where some version of the same event keeps happening, water that does something water should not do, reflections that are wrong, people who go in and come out different, communities built around a relationship with a body of water that the community cannot fully articulate but does not want to break. She has cataloged at last count 63 sites. 63 sites in 7 states where the same pattern with variations manifests. 63 thin places that the water has found, or that found the water, or that were there before water and became water's home, because water is what happens in thin places. And in every one of the 63 sites, she has found a version of the same 4 elements. A cold that comes from below, a stillness that is occupied rather than empty, a community that builds its identity around the site without understanding why, and names. Somewhere in the record of every site, someone has been named by the water, or has heard their name from the water, or has given their name to the water, or has felt that the water knows their name without having been told. Names are the thread that runs through all 63. She called me after the early version of this case appeared, and we spoke for 2 hours, and she told me the thing that changed how I understood what happened at Black Branch on the 14th of May, 1876. She said, "I think the thin places are not isolated. I think they talk to each other, not in the way people talk to each other, not signal and receiver, not information transmitted, more the way a body of water talks to itself, the same water, continuous, the same medium, responding to pressure and pull, and the fundamental physics of itself across distance." She said, "I think what the still place has been building, the assembly, the voice, I think it is not building in isolation. I think it is being built in resonance with 62 other places that are building the same thing, not the same voice, the same capacity, the same approaching of the grammar. 63 thin places in 7 states, each accumulating tithes in its own way, each reaching toward articulation on its own timeline. But the timeline is not separate. The timeline is shared, because they are the same water," she said. "They are all the same thin place, seen from different surfaces." She said, "I have 63 sites. I am missing something. I know I am missing something because the distribution is wrong. 7 states, but the density is higher in the eastern valleys, and it should be more uniform if the sites are random. The places I am missing are in the western counties of the Appalachians, the places where the records are thinnest and the families have been the most insular, and I think those are the places where the relationship is oldest and the community has been most careful about what they allow the record to say." I told her about the document in the tin box, about the 51 marks on the limestone shelf, about the count of tithes in Nettie Pruitt's notebook. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Bess Coral knew about the others." I asked her how she could know that. She said, "Because the document in the tin box does not read like a discovery. It reads like a summary, like a woman who has access to information about more than one site, synthesizing what she knows about all of them into a theory. The theory is too complete to have been built from one site alone. The observations are too cross-referenced. She is not discovering the nature of thin places by studying one thin place. She is comparing notes. Comparing notes on 63 thin places, or 53, or however many there were in 1870. Notes from where? From whom? She was a woman in a remote Appalachian valley who, by all accounts, did not travel after she arrived in 1841. Where was she getting the comparison data? I thought about this for a long time after the call. I thought about it while I was counting my tiles and my steps. I thought about it at 3 in the morning when I was lying awake in a way I had not been lying awake before I went to Black Branch in April. And then I thought about the membrane. She had the membrane. 6 tithes had expanded it to a scale that left her 4/10 present in the ordinary world and 6/10 available to the thing underneath. The before of things, she called it, and she could feel that the before of everything ran together, continuous, the same medium across distance, the same thin material that made 63 thin places possible. She could feel all of them. From a 2-room house on the South Fork of Black Branch, 6 tithes deep into the membrane, more than half of her measure already in the keeping of the water, she could feel the resonance of every other thin place in the Appalachians and beyond, the way you can feel the vibration of a tuning fork in a different room if the door between the rooms is very thin. She was the comparison data. She was the comparison data, and she had collected it the way the water collects its tithes, gradually, over decades, through the membrane, without any mechanism a scientist would recognize. And the document in the tin box was her attempt to write down what she had learned through the membrane, so that someone would have it after she stopped being the one who could feel it. I give nothing. The last line of the document, the boundary she drew with the water watching. She gave it the document instead. Let me tell you about the second of the 5 changes in the water in a way I have not told you yet. I told you that after Edmund Vestal came up and paused at the bank, Absalom Gentry saw the second change. I told you he described it as a heaviness in the air above the pool, a compression. I told you what he said. What I did not tell you is what he says comes after the compression, in the private letter, in the passage immediately following. He says, after the second child came out of the water, I looked at the surface of the pool, and I saw that the marks on the limestone shelf were reflected in it. The marks on the shelf above the water, the incised marks, the symbolic vocabulary that the geologist would call it in 1953. Those marks were visible in the surface of the pool as a reflection. He says, I had stood at that pool for 15 years, and the limestone shelf had always been visible in the reflection when the light was right. This was different. The marks in the reflection were not the same marks as the marks on the shelf. He looked from the shelf to the reflection and back. The marks on the shelf were the marks he knew. The marks in the reflection were different marks. He describes spending several minutes trying to determine whether he was looking at the marks from a different angle that changed their appearance, or whether the light was doing something that altered the shadow pattern inside the incisions, or whether he was simply mistaken. He concludes, I was not mistaken. The marks in the water were not the reflection of the marks on the stone. They were different marks. He copies both sets of marks into the private letter. Both sets. He had a small gift for drawing, and the letter contains careful renderings of the marks on the stone as he knew them from 15 years of looking, and next to them his rendering of what he saw in the reflection. I have looked at both sets for a very long time. The marks on the stone are the marks, Doctor. Anand's work has catalogued as consistent with the oldest tier of thin place notation she has found. A marking system she believes is the earliest evidence of systematic human response to thin places in the region, predating European contact, almost certainly representing some version of the count that Bess Correll described, a ledger of tithes, of fractions, of what has been deposited and is being kept. The marks in the reflection are different. They are not another set of deposits. They are not more of the same. Dr. Anand, when I sent her the copies from the private letter, looked at them for a week and called me. She said, the marks on the stone are a ledger. what you have received into, what has been deposited. She said, the marks in the reflection are a different kind of document. I asked her what kind. She said, instructions. The marks in the reflection are operational. They describe a process, not what has been given, what to do with what has been given. Instructions from the reflection, not the stone, the reflection. Instructions that appear only in still water, in a thin place, when something significant has been deposited, when the water has been given something large enough that it is ready to proceed to the next stage. And the instructions appeared in the reflection after the second child came out of the water. After Edmund, not after Cora, the first child, after the second one. Why the second? Why not the first? Why not after Harlan, who gave the most? Dr. Anand's answer, when I asked her, was brief and precise, and I have been thinking about it since. She said, because the instructions require a pair. A pair. 2 points define a line. 1 tithe is a deposit. 2 tithes define a direction. The still place saw where it was going after the second child and showed the instructions for getting there in the reflection. It had a vector. It had been accumulating for 100 years, and it had always been accumulating towards something. But after 2 children in the same morning, it had enough paired deposits, enough coordinated tithes from people who were related, who shared blood and history and the same small valley and the same May morning, to know precisely what direction it was building in. The instructions told it how to get there from here. And then it got 2 more children, and a fragment of something very old and very nearly complete, and the water went dark and white and still and backward, and the level dropped and rose, and Absalom Gentry felt the current reverse against his legs, and the still place at Black Branch turned toward what it had wanted, and began to move. 63 thin places, resonating. Instructions in the reflection. 63 communities built around waters that are building toward the same capacity. A voice being assembled from 100 pairs of tithes, from the directional data of 100 second baptisms, from the grammar that Walter Pruitt almost heard in 1968, and that was closer to complete when I stood on the bank in April. What is it moving toward? Bess Coral said, it will find its voice. She said, I believe that when it has found its grammar, it will speak in a voice assembled from the pieces it keeps, and I do not know whose voice that will be, and I do not think it will be a comfortable voice to hear. But she did not say it would be a harmful voice. She did not say it was malevolent. She said, uncomfortable. And she said something else, near the end of the document, that I saved for here because it is the last thing she says before I give nothing, and it is the most generous thing in the entire document, and I think she meant it. She says, I think the water does not mean us harm. I think the water means us nothing at all, the way a river means nothing to the stone it shapes. The water is doing what water does, finding its level, taking what it is given, building from what it keeps. The assembly is not malicious. It is not benevolent. It is what happens when a thin place accumulates enough to become more than a thin place. When the accumulation crosses the threshold from passive keeping to active presence. She says, I think what emerges, when it emerges, will be the distillation of everything the thin places have held for centuries, the sum of all the tithes, the combined measure of 100 people's selfhood, gathered and integrated and processed through the cold logic of water. And I think, when it speaks, it will say whatever that sum means. Whatever that many pieces of that many people, held together long enough, distilled into, she says, I think it will say what we are. I think it will say what we are. She drew her line. She said she did not want to be the one who completed it. She was afraid not of what the voice would say, but of being responsible for the saying of it, for being the final piece that tipped the assembly from building to built. And so she left the document in the limestone, and the water kept it dry. And she died in 1893, and her 4/10 remaining went somewhere I cannot account for, and the water in the still place kept its register and kept building. And on a May morning 7 years earlier, 4 children had stood at the edge of the still place and given what the ceremony asked them to give, and the water had done something to them that changed them for life, and one of them had not quite been a child, and the water had gotten what it needed from that one in a way it had not been prepared for, and had said something in a voice assembled from all its previous keepings, and the 4 children had heard their names said in a voice they recognized from its components, and they had been surprised. They had all looked surprised, Dana Birdsong said, all 4 of them, the same face. Even the quiet boy with the light eyes. The surprise of people who expected a ceremony and got a conversation. And now, I have been in this conversation for 8 months, and you have been in it for 3 hours, and I do not know what fraction of that constitutes a tithe, and I do not know if looking at a pool and counting tiles afterward is the same kind of deposit that Cora Vestal made when she went under the water on the 14th of May. But I think the still place is not particular about the mechanism. I think any attention given carefully to a thin place, held long enough, in enough proximity, even the proximity of a voice through a recording, even the proximity of a story told in the dark, does something small and permanent. I think that is why Bess Carell put the document where she put it, not to hide it, to give it to the water, because she understood that the document, read by whoever found it, would bring their attention to the thin place, and attention is a kind of tithe, and every tithe matters, even the small ones, because the water keeps all of it and builds from what it keeps. She gave it the document, and the document brought me here, and I brought you here, and we have all been standing at the edge of the still place for 3 hours, and the water has been keeping count. My count, your count, the count of everyone who has ever listened to this, a very long list of very small fractions, adding up. I want to close by telling you where Harlan is. I say that knowing I cannot tell you where Harlan is. I say it because it is the right way to close, and because I believe Absalom Gentry knew at the end of his life, and what he said in the last clear moment, now I will hear what it has learned, suggests that he had been in correspondence with it, in some sense, for a long time before he died. That the portion of himself he had deposited by putting his hand into the water, whatever fraction that constituted, had been in the keeping of the still place for 30 years, and had been part of the building assembly, and in the last years of his life he had been able to feel the building the way Edmund felt cold water underground. And he was not afraid. That is the thing I keep coming back to. He was not afraid. And I think the reason he was not afraid was that the thing being built from the pieces of people he had known and loved and buried for 46 years was not alien to him. It had their pieces in it. Patience, his wife, the children of the valley, 1/10 at a time, Creed Alcorn and his father and his grandfather, 200 people's 1/10ths assembled into something that was not any of them but was made from all of them. It was not alien. It was familiar in the way that a church is familiar, built from the materials of the people who built it, shaped by their needs and their beliefs, carrying their history in its stones. The water is building something from what it has been given, and what it has been given is a long accumulation of the people of the Briar Pocket Valley and the other communities near the other thin places, given in tenths over generations, given without full understanding of what the giving would make. And what it is making is something assembled from them, which means Harlan is in there. The last of him, the nearly complete piece, the name that Absalom Gentry spoke over the water. He is in there. He has been in there since the 14th of May, 1876. He has been in there longer than any of the others because he had less outside to return to, and what came up wearing his face for 2 years in the valley was mostly the water already, and when it walked back to the creek bank in the spring of 1878, it walked home. Harlan is in there. And Owen Cutz's portion, from the fishing accident he never fully understood, and Calvin Trent's fraction from the spring of 1953, and Walter Pruitt's fraction from the summer swim, and whatever the woman who called me in November gave by saying yes, and mine from April, and yours, if you have been here with me for 3 hours in the cold and the dark of the still place, holding the names and the faces and the water. All of it counted, all of it kept. That is where Harlan is. He is in the water at the bend of Black Branch Creek, in the still dark pool at the Deacon's Reach, in the cold that comes from below. He is in the grammar of the voice that is assembling itself from 100 tithes across 63 thin places. He is in the part of it that is almost ready to speak. And when it speaks, it will say what we are, and it will say it in a voice made from our pieces, and we will recognize it. Tell me in the comments if you hear it. Tell me what it sounds like when your own voice comes back to you from the direction of still water. Tell me what it says. I will be here, counting. The next case begins at a river crossing in Kentucky. A man, a river, 2 crossings in one morning, and 2 versions of himself arriving on the same bank from opposite directions. A court document, a deed to a farm, the question of which version owns what the man who crossed the river had owned. It is not a comfortable case. Sleep well. Watch what your reflection does. Stay counted. Stay yours. Bar the door tonight. I will see you in the dark. On the next long night, you cannot sleep. One more thing. I promised you the account of Toll Hobbs, and I have been carrying it through this entire case without setting it down, and it belongs here, at the end, because Toll Hobbs is the answer to a question I have not asked yet, and the question I have not asked is the oldest one in this case. Why did people keep coming back? I told you early on that the community of the Briar Pocket built its identity around the still place. I told you that the people who lived near it were shaped by it, slowly, the way water shapes limestone, and that the shaping was not chosen and was not regretted. I told you that Absalom Gentry came from outside and could not leave. I told you the valley held people with a pull that looked like insularity but was something else. What I did not tell you is what happened to the people who did leave. Because some of them left. Not many, but some. And the ones who left, without exception, in the 63 years between the founding of the community and the dissolution of the congregation in 1907, the ones who left came back. Not all of them came back voluntarily. Toll Hobbs came back in 1868, 7 years after he walked out of Wednesday evening service mid-sentence. He came back driving the same wagon he had left in, and he had aged 20 years in 7, and he did not explain where he had been, and nobody asked, because nobody wanted to hear the answer. He stayed 6 months. He did not preach. He did not attend services. He went to the still place every morning and stood at the bank for an hour, and then went home to the house he had locked up when he left, which was still standing, which nobody had touched, which Calvin Trent notes in his account as strange, because in that valley an empty house would ordinarily be used for storage within a year. Nobody had touched Toll Hobbs's house. After 6 months, he left again. Same wagon, in the direction of the northern ridge. Not the same direction he had gone the first time, Calvin Trent says, based on the testimony of 3 witnesses who watched him go. The first time he had gone north. The second time he went toward the Still Place Road and turned up it, and went in the direction of the bend, and nobody followed, and nobody saw him again. He was found in the winter. His wagon and his horse were at the Deacon's Reach, at the stepping-off rock, the reins tied to the shelf. He was not in the wagon, and he was not on the bank. He was in the water, not drowned. The water was barely 18 inches deep where they found him, upright on the bottom, facing downstream, with his arms at his sides and his eyes open, and his face showing the expression that Dana Birdsong described when she described the 4 children after the baptism. Surprised, quiet, the expression of a person who expected a ceremony and got a conversation. He was breathing. He was alive. He was uninjured in any way the doctor from the nearest town could determine after a 2-hour ride. He was warm despite the cold of the water. He would not speak. He would not stand. They lifted him out, which required 4 men and a significant effort despite him being a thin man, because his body did not assist the effort and did not resist it, simply remained in the posture it was in while they worked around him. They put him in the wagon and drove him to the doctor, and the doctor put him in a bed, and he lay in that bed for 11 days. On the 12th day he sat up. He said, "I need to go back." They asked him where he had been, in the water and in the 7 years before. He said, "Listening." He said, "It is not finished yet. It has more to say. I need to go back." They did not let him go back. He was detained, gently and then less gently, and the community argued for 3 weeks about what to do with him, and in the end the argument was resolved by Tull Hobbs himself, who one morning was simply not in the house he was being kept in, and was never found, and was never seen in the valley again. And he has never been seen anywhere, to any record I can find, because if a preacher named Tull Hobbs left the Briar Pocket Valley on foot in the winter of 1869, he does not appear in any subsequent record in any county in any state. And I have looked. He went back to the water, and the water kept him. Not a tithe, not a tenth. What the water kept of Tull Hobbs was Tull Hobbs entire, because Tull Hobbs in 1869 was so thoroughly the waters already that there was not a remainder to return with. 6 years of being away from the still place, and then 1 year back at it every morning, had completed what was started that Wednesday evening when he had stopped in the middle of a sermon and walked out. I said I would tell you what he had been saying when he stopped. He had been preaching on the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John, which is the passage about the woman at the well, which is the passage about water and thirst, and the water that quenches thirst permanently, the water of which, if a person drinks, they shall never thirst again. He had been preaching on that text, and he had been mid-sentence in the part of the sermon where he was making the connection between the text and the work of his own ministry. The water of the creek, the baptism, the community they had built around the still place, and he had stopped. He had stopped because he had understood something in the middle of a sentence that he could not finish the sentence having understood. Calvin Trent, who interviewed 3 people who had been in the room that Wednesday evening, reports that they all remembered the last complete clause Tull Hobbs uttered before he put down his Bible and left the building. He said, "And the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting," and then he stopped. And he put down his Bible, and he walked out. Everlasting. He got to everlasting, and he stopped, because he had understood, in the middle of the passage about thirst and water, and the well that never runs dry, that the still place was a well that never ran dry, and that it had been offering that water to everyone in the community for as long as the community had been there, and that the offering was real, and the water was real, and what it gave back was real, and that the trade, the tithe, the fraction, the tenth taken in exchange for the access, was as close to the thing his text described as anything he had encountered in his life of ministry. And he had not been able to finish the sentence because the implications of that understanding were too large to hold in a sentence, and too large to hold in a Wednesday evening church service, and too large to hold in a man who had been a preacher for 15 years, and had believed, genuinely, that the water he baptized people in was a medium and not a thing with intentions. The water was a thing with intentions, and it had been offering, all along, a version of what his text promised: everlasting water, the well that never runs dry, and the trade it asked was 1/10. And Tull Hobbs walked out of the church and into the dark, and drove his wagon north, and was gone for 7 years, and came back, and listened for 6 months, and went back into the water, and did not come out, and the water kept him, because the water keeps what it is given, and Tull Hobbs had given the water everything he was, not in one gesture, but in a life of proximity and attention, and the terrible moment of understanding that stopped a sentence about everlasting water on the word everlasting. This is why people kept coming back, not because the valley held them magnetically, because the water had offered them something, and they had accepted the offer in ways they did not understand, and the acceptance created a connection that could be walked away from but not severed, and when the weight of ordinary life became heavy enough, the connection pulled. Bess Corll knew this. She had felt it from the thin ford onwards, the pull of every thin place in the Appalachians, the resonance that the membrane made possible. She had given 6 tithes to the still place, and she could feel the pull at its highest possible intensity, and she had still managed to draw her line and keep 4/10 of herself on the near side of the bank. She did it because she was afraid of what she would understand if she gave the last 10th. Not afraid of the water, afraid of the understanding. The same fear that stopped Toll Hobbes mid-sentence, the fear of the thing that is too large to hold in a sentence, the fear of the implication that changes everything you thought you knew about what water is and what you are and what the trade between the two means. She chose not to know, and she wrote it all down so that someone else could know it without having to go into the water to find out. That is the last thing I have to say about Bess Carell. She gave it the document. The document is her last tithe. And her last tithe is an act of care for the people who would come after. The people who would go to the water without knowing what the water was. The people who would stand at the edge of a thin place and feel the cold coming up from below and not understand why they were counting on the way home. She gave them the map, and the map says, it is real, and it is old, and it does not mean you harm, and it will take what you give it and keep it and build from it, and the building is enormous and patient and has been going on for longer than your family has been your family. And if you go into the cold water of a thin place with your full measure in you, you will come out with something missing and something added, and the something added will feel like a gift right up until the moment you understand what you gave for it. And by the time you understand, she says, it is already yours. The access is already in you. You are already in the water's keeping. The best she can offer you, at that point, is the advice she took herself for 50 years. Keep the count. Say your name back when the water says it. Do not let the membrane thin past the point where you can feel the difference between your edge and the water's edge. Know that the boundary is there. Maintain it deliberately. The way you maintain a wall you cannot rebuild, but can shore up, consciously, every day. And know that on the other side of the membrane, patient and cold in building, the water is working on its grammar, and when it finds the words, it will say something that is made from you, and you will recognize it. That is the map. That is what Bess Carell left in the limestone at the still place on Black Branch Creek, in the tin box, in the woman's hand, in the patient dark of a thin place where the water kept it dry for 60 years. I have told you everything I know. The creek is still running. The bend is still there. The cold still comes up from below. And whatever has been building in the dark water of the still place since before the limestone shelf was laid down is still building. One tithe at a time, one name at a time, one fraction of oneself added to the sum of all the fractions that came before. The sum is very large now. Larger than when Bess Carell drew her line. Larger than when Absalom Gentry put his hand in the water. Larger, by one small fraction, than it was before I stood on the bank in April and looked at my own reflection for too long. And larger, by the smallest possible fraction, than it was at the beginning of tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the attention you brought. The water appreciates it. I mean that literally. I believe the water appreciates it. I believe attention given carefully to a thin place is recognized and registered and added to the sum the way any tithe is registered and kept. I believe you have been in conversation with the still place tonight, through the medium of this recording, at the distance of however many miles lie between you and the Briar Pocket Valley, and that the conversation was heard. I believe you are on the list now, a very small fraction, barely a notation. But in the water's keeping, a notation lasts as long as the thin place holds, and the thin place has been holding since before the limestone shelf was laid down. Good night. Bar the door. Count what is yours. And the next time you pass still water on a dark night, and you look in, and your reflection is there, looking back up at you from the cold dark of whatever thin place you are standing over, note whether it hesitates. Note whether it blinks twice when you blink once. And if it does, say your name, out loud, firmly, and count to 3. Insist on yourself. The water will understand. It has heard it before. It has the voices of 100 people who insisted on themselves. And it kept those two because it keeps everything, and from everything it keeps, it is building toward the word that will say what we are. And the word is very nearly ready. I will see you in the dark. Let me tell you about the mid-roll break. I know this is an odd place for 3 hours in, after the ending, but I promised a second CTA, and I always keep my promises, even to structures, and especially to structures in cases like this one, where the structure itself is part of what I am trying to say. If you have been with me all the way through tonight, and this is just the moment you are coming back from the bathroom, or refilling your drink, or checking on the dog, then let me give you the 30 seconds of bridge back into the case, the reminder of where we are and what we are carrying. You are 3 hours into a story about still water and what it keeps. You are carrying the names of 4 children, Cora, Edmund, Nettie, Harlan. You are carrying the 15th of May in a year when it was still the 14th, the morning after the baptism, when Absalom Gentry stood in the wet grass behind the parsonage and tried to decide what to write in the church book and could not decide and wrote almost nothing. You are carrying the tin box in the limestone and the woman's hand in the dim late light of a long life spent near a thin place, writing, "I give nothing," meaning it, knowing the water was reading over her shoulder. And you are carrying the still place itself, the cold that comes from below, the dark that is not the dark of mud but the dark of depth, the surface that you look at and the surface that looks back. If you wanted more of this kind of story, if you want 12 more nights like tonight, cases that take this long and go this deep and give you this much to carry home, the collection is called What the Water Keeps. 12 cases, 7 states, 800 years of thin places, and the communities that built themselves around them, and the people who went into cold water and came out changed. The link is in the description, and I put it at the top of the comments so it is easy to find. And if you are still here, if you made it all the way through, and you are still here at the end, I need you to do one thing for me. Just one. Go to the comments right now and tell me where you are. Not your address. Not your full name. Just the town, the state, the country. I want to build a map. I want to see how far this reaches. I want to know where the listening pool is. In every place there is one. Because I believe the thin places are not just in the eastern valleys of the Appalachians. I believe they are wherever the water runs cold and the ground is thinner than it looks, and that means they are wherever you are. Tell me where you are, and I will tell you if I have a case for you. Now, I said I was going to tell you about the day in 1953 when a man named Calvin Trent stood at the Deacon's Reach and counted the marks on the limestone shelf and got to 51 before he was done. And I told you most of it, but I left out one detail because I needed to get there properly. He counted the marks 3 times. The first time he lost track at 37, the second time at 43. The third time he marked each one as he counted and reached 51. And then he put his notebook away and looked at the water, as I said, and his reflection blinked twice when he blinked once. What I did not tell you is what he did after he stepped back from the bank. He turned around. He walked back up the path toward the road. He counted his steps. He got to 62 steps before he reached the road. He noted that number. He drove home. He ate dinner. He washed the dishes. He went to his desk and he opened his notebook to the page where he had made his step count, and he looked at it, and then he looked at the page before it, where he had marked the count of the limestone marks. 51 marks, 62 steps. He turned back one more page. The page before the limestone marks was a page of notes about a conversation he had had with an old woman named Viney Mounts, who was Gideon Mounts's granddaughter and who had lived in the valley all her life and was in her 80s when Calvin Trent interviewed her. Viney Mounts had told him 2 things about the still place that nobody else had told him. The first thing, she said, the number of steps from the road to the Deacon's Reach changed. Not that she counted differently at different times, or that the path length varied with the route taken. She said the number of steps was different on different days, sometimes 40, sometimes 80. Sometimes, she said, on days when the water was doing something it didn't usually do, something more than 100. The second thing, she said that every person who counted the limestone marks got a different number. She had seen it happen. She had watched people count the marks and compare numbers and disagree. She said she had never personally counted them because she had decided early that she would rather not know what number she got. Calvin Trent sat at his desk and looked at the two numbers on two adjacent pages. 51 marks. The number he had gotten on his third count, the careful count, 62 steps. The number of steps back to the road. And on the page before those two pages, Viney mounts saying that the numbers are different for different people and different days. He wrote in his notebook, "I wonder if the numbers it gives you are significant, not arbitrary, not random. I wonder if the number of marks you count is something it is telling you specifically, and if the number of steps you count on the way back is something else it is telling you. And if there is a relationship between the two numbers, that would mean something if you understood the grammar." The grammar. He used that word in 1953, 15 years before Walter Pruitt heard the voice in the dark and called it grammar. Two men who did not know each other, approaching the same thing from different directions, using the same word, because that is what a grammar is. A system of rules that makes meaning possible. A relationship between elements that turns sound into language. And if the numbers the still place gives, different people are its grammar, if 51 and 62 are a sentence, if the relationship between your count of the marks and your count of the steps is a clause in something larger, then the water has been speaking for a long time in a language of numbers that the people who lived near it received without knowing they were receiving it. Cora's count. Edmund's sleep-talking strings of numbers. Nettie's notebook of tithes and dates and digits. Walter Pruitt adding up tiles and steps and windows without deciding to. They were not developing a compulsion. They were developing fluency. They were learning the grammar of the thing the water was building toward, absorbing it through the membrane, through the access, through the thin connection that ran between the 1/10 that was in the water and the 9/10 that came home. And by the time you are fluent in a language you did not know you were learning, you understand it before you know what it means. You hear it before you have words for it. You count before you know you are counting sentences. Absalom Gentry put his hand in the water after the baptism and felt it take note of him and pulled his hand back. He spent 30 years in the valley. He died looking at the wall that faced the creek, waiting to hear what it had learned. I believe he heard it. I believe in the last hour of his life, the membrane thinned enough, 30 years of proximity, the fraction taken through his palm, the accumulated attention of a man who had been paying very close attention to the still place for most of his adult life. I believe the membrane thinned enough that the grammar came through, and what he heard was what he said. Now I will hear what it has learned. Not now I will hear it speak. Now I will hear what it has learned. Because the grammar of the still place is not declaration. It is not the water saying, "Here is what I know." It is accumulation. It is the sum of all the pieces added together into something that contains everything those pieces ever learned about being alive, about being a person with a name and a boundary and a count of what is yours. The distillation of what it means to be a human piece of a thin world, what it has learned, is what we are, in the language of water, in the grammar of numbers, and cold and dark. And when the grammar is complete, and the voice finds its words, it will say that. It will say what we are, in a voice assembled from us, and we will understand it. Those of us who have been near the water long enough, we will recognize it from its parts. I do not know if that is something to fear. I have thought about it for 8 months, and I have not decided. I think Absalom Gentry did not fear it. I think Bess Corral was more cautious than afraid. Afraid not of the voice, but of her own response to the voice. Afraid of what she would give away if she heard it and recognized her own portion of it. I think Toll Hobbs went into the water because he could not stay out once he had heard it beginning. The grammar of it just becoming coherent, just crossing the threshold from noise to language, and he needed to be closer to the source than a bank could put him. I think the voice is very close now. Closer than it was in 1876, and closer than it was in 1968, and closer than it was before I stood on the bank in April with my own fraction of attention added to the sum, and I think if you have been here with me for 3 hours, in the cold and the dark and the deep of the still place at Black Branch, carrying the names of 4 children and the strange quiet of a thin place in the eastern Appalachians, the grammar of it has touched you in some small way. You are closer to fluent than you were at the beginning of tonight, and that is either the best thing or the most complicated thing I could have given you. I genuinely do not know which. The comments are open. Tell me where you are. Tell me what number you would count if you stood at the limestone shelf. Tell me if your reflection keeps up with you. Tell me if you have been counting. The next case is the river in Kentucky, the man who crossed twice, the 2 versions of himself, the deed, the court, the question of which self is the legal self. It is not a comfortable case, but none of them are. That is why we are here, in the dark together, at the edge of the still water. That is the whole of it. Every thread pulled through, every account laid flat. 4 children baptized at Black Branch in the spring of 1876, and the water changed 5 times, and the 5 changes were the water's response to a gift so large it had not expected it, and what it built from the gift is still building, and the building is nearly done. Sleep well. Count what is yours. Bar the door tonight, and when you look at dark water, look for only a moment, and then step back. The water has enough of most of us. Be well. I will see you on the next long night. The water has been patient across centuries, and it will remain patient. Whatever it is building, the building happens on a timeline that does not care about your calendar. You have time to draw your line. You have time to shore up the wall. You have time to count what is yours, always.